What should be the form of American democracy? La Follette and like-minded reformers capitalized on the convergence of three trajectories: elite division that dissipated opposition to reform, political advocacy by motivated entrepreneurs, and an institutional trajectory rooted in reforming political parties and their selection of candidates. They propelled 24 states to adopt presidential primaries by the early 1920s. The trajectory of direct primaries stops, however, at about this point. The primaries' interrupted development defies mechanical models of institutional change that assume a near-automatic extension and knee-jerk correlations of its initial launch with its routine use today. Missing is the sustained, widespread, and intense pushback that halted its development and, in certain respects, reversed it. Also lost is a significant feature of this resistance: sustained debate over the form of American democracy and proposals to move in the opposite direction of direct primaries. Fewer elections of greater importance. The limits of reform. The introduction of the direct primary in the early 20th century was predictably opposed by entrenched interests that benefited from existing local and state party machines. The power of entrenched parties was augmented, however, by a surprising source: progressives who shared La Follette's commitment to confronting monopolies and trusts, but opposed his candidate selection reform. The broad assault on the direct primary, and specifically the presidential primary, had by mid-century upended La Follette's plan and prevented it from controlling nominations. After the 1960 elections, the presidential primary was adopted and used by only one additional state. Of the 24 states that did adopt presidential primaries, 3 states used it only once. The backlash against it was so strong that 9 states repealed it. Iowa and Minnesota, for instance, held presidential primaries in 1916 and repealed them the next year. When not rolling back presidential primaries, many states that retained them weakened them or narrowed participation in them to party members through closed primaries and tighter restrictions on membership. New York and Illinois bolstered the power of state conventions in the 1920s to select delegates, and New Jersey barred voters who contributed to one party from participating in another party's primary. Southern states used the poll tax, literacy tests, and other measures to exclude African Americans, as we discuss later. Louise Overacker, a leading scholar of primaries in the 1920s and later decades, reported that the presidential primaries in the states are at a standstill and cannot possibly control the choice of the presidential convention because they failed to matter for the majority of delegates. Even by the 1960s, presidential primaries existed but were unable to dictate nominations, as they do today. Why did the presidential primary stall? The challenges not only display the nature of political power at the turn of the century, but also reveal compelling critiques of the direct primary that anticipated later flaws, as well as posing alternative directions that were conceivable a century ago. 3 sources of resistance to direct primaries stand out. State and local political parties fought back. Despite the assault of progressives on the political machine, networks of state and local parties remained formidable due to their influence over government contracts and jobs, and they were eager to defeat or neutralize direct primaries. The first significant use of the presidential primary, Taft and Teddy Roosevelt's competition for the 1912 Republican nomination, illustrated the continued power of the old order. The contest confirmed TR's lasting popularity, but the nomination was nonetheless dictated by the Republican Party's National Committee, controlled by party officials, and Taft. President Warren Harding, who was beholden to the Ohio gang of political bosses and business titans, openly craved the return of the old-style party conventions. "I had rather have men appeal for support on the pronouncement of party conventions," he proclaimed in 1922, "than to have the appeal of the individual for his particular locality." A city attorney for Chicago testified to a reform conference in New York City in favor of the existing party organization as a powerful, well-controlled engine. From New York State, a Senate Majority Leader coarsely derided the direct primary as an abomination that ought to be skinned alive. He too recommended a return to the state convention system and won bipartisan support. The early 20th century research of Indiana University political scientist James Albert Woodburn dispelled the hopeful promises made on behalf of direct primaries. They promote rather than check electoral corruption by encouraging a large and corrupt use of money. Far from cleaning up elections, candidates who have money have as good a chance for the nomination in a primary as in a convention. The Chicago city attorney agreed. The illiterate and degenerate voters who control the direct vote system can be purchased for a drink. Media reports and studies of state and local elections in New York and elsewhere confirmed the continued use of money and inside dealing to steer nominations. Political figures who assailed direct primaries were, of course, defending their own interests, and were not shy about acknowledging that. Indeed, they used this candor as a weapon against La Follette. He was taken to task for chastising party machines for doling out patronage, while he did it himself. The Wisconsinite routinely gave out state jobs for game wardens, inspectors, and more to retain the loyalty of supporters and build his own political organization. Critics, according to one historian, assailed him for being a selfish hypocrite and political trickster who professed to champion the rights of the people only to obtain political power. Independent analysts and defenders of the political establishment underscored La Follette's false claims of moral superiority and truthfulness. Statecraft. Political figures and progressive intellectuals challenged the direct primary for neglecting what Herbert Croly considered prudent statecraft. Early institutional designers placed a priority on aligning the choice of citizens and the national interest with the incentives and structures that dictate the pursuit of power by candidates. Their aim was to sort out presidential candidates who were authoritarians, demagogues, and threats to the authority and legitimacy of the Constitution and representative democracy. For La Follette and supporters of the direct primary, statecraft and institutional design to balance citizen voice and quality leadership took a back seat. Their priority was to anchor government decision-making and elite behavior in the amorphous concept of the people. Critics mocked the populist adulation of the people and were incredulous at the proposition that this monolith could police elected representatives. The result, they warned, would degrade the quality of candidates and imperil democratic government. Henry J. Ford, Princeton University professor and president of the American Political Science Association from 1918 to 1919, warned that reformers mouth the sentimental cant of giving power to the people, but in practice dissipated power and thwarted the selection of the wisest and best for public office. Primary contests shifted the incentives toward freewheeling candidates who built their own organizations and loyal followings. The new candidate selection process creates, the Chicago attorney testified, a vacuum with no responsible head to either select a strong candidate or prevent bad and unwise nominations. An officer of the Municipal Association of Cleveland echoed this conclusion at a conference on progressive reform. The primary tends to select candidates who are not acceptable from the point of view of a party well-wisher or a citizen desiring to see competent and faithful persons selected to administer public affairs. The result, detractors warned, would be pestiferous demagogues and brazen-faced men of a lower type of character. Among voters who are distracted and poorly informed, the candidates most likely to win excel at the repulsive and disgraceful undertaking of begging for an office by making outlandish promises and practicing the deceptions of a demagogue. A series of studies during the initial launch of the direct primary reported that it tends to weaken and destroy the party and diminish America's capacity to govern in the public interest. The political rationality of factions. Supporters of good government and progressive reform pilloried the direct primary for imperiling representative government by shifting power to factions. Crowley slammed La Follette and his allies for their absurd multiplication of elections. They swelled the number of elections in the name of engaging citizens, but had the opposite effect. Public interest flagged. Multiplying elections would outstrip the interest and knowledge of citizens who could not be magically transformed into selfless patriots. With everyday citizens drained, control over nomination fell to embittered and unscrupulous factions, committed to their narrow agendas, instead of the national interest or broad coalitions. The Chicago city attorney testified at the New York Conference on Political Reform that primaries rewarded candidates with intense pockets of support. They win crowded races by receiving a plurality and are nominated by a small minority. Professor Ford agreed that the primary impairs the responsibility to govern by making power the football of faction and scrambling power among faction chiefs and their bands. The Cleveland officials similarly blamed the introduction of primaries for leaving the party weak and unorganized and fostering severe and bitter divisions. The effect is to splinter the class and ethnic interests that the party had previously stitched together. For ambitious politicians searching for success, the most rational path for advancement in an environment with direct primaries is to appeal to organized factions. FDR's 1938 purge and the defeat of the primary. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's losing battles with conservative Democrats to pass his New Deal agenda underscore the continuing control of state and local party establishments over candidate nominations, decades after La Follette's campaign for primaries. Following FDR's inauguration in March 1933, he unleashed a barrage of legislation to tackle the Great Depression that was opposed by conservative, and often Southern, members of Congress in his own Democratic Party. After conservative opposition continued to block his priorities in his second term, such as the Fair Labor Standards Act and an executive reorganization bill, FDR struck back by supporting liberal Democratic candidates who ran against the traitors in the 1938 midterm primary elections. In his June 24, 1938, fireside chat, the president heralded his determination to increase Democratic votes for his popular legislation by using the direct primary to make the nominating process a more democratic one. Primary elections equipped him, he reasoned, to mobilize public support in a clear-cut choice between candidates for a Democratic nomination who would be loyal liberals instead of anti-New Deal traitors. FDR's gambit to build a loyal New Deal coalition in Congress pitted the institutional power of two candidate selection systems, the primary against the traditional state and local party organization. FDR's effort to purge obstructionist Democrats in congressional primaries largely failed. After the 1938 elections, he abandoned his efforts to chase out his party's conservatives and create a Democratic Party unified in backing the New Deal. He followed the advice of Jim Farley, Democratic Party chair, that he accept conservatives and promote harmony and teamwork. Following FDR's defeats, damage control became a priority, and he mended fences with conservatives he had targeted. The source of FDR's defeat was his exaggerated expectations of primary elections and underestimation of the party establishment. It proved too strong, even when pitted against a popular president during a national emergency. Alternatives to the direct primary. The clash between the advocates and critics of direct primaries framed an enduring question. What should be the form of American democracy? Two of the progressive era's intellectual leaders, Walter Lippmann and Herbert Croly, criticized the party machine and agreed that it was imperative to modernize the national government to manage industrialization and America's place in an increasingly global world. Croly shared the concern of many progressives with the country's dangerous inequality in the distribution of power. The concentration of wealth and financial power, he cautioned, was inimical to democracy because it tends to erect political abuses and social inequalities into a system. Lippmann and Croly were also stinging critics of the direct primary and favored rolling it back. They parted ways, however, on how to achieve responsible governance. Lippmann's criticism of the direct primary reflected a fundamental conviction that the role of citizens is excessive and needs to be substantially diminished. No amount of direct primaries, Lippmann derisively asserted, will make a democracy out of an illiterate people. The voter, he continued, cannot grasp the details of the problems of the day because he has not the time, the interest, or the knowledge. Instead of achieving a better public opinion because the voter is asked to express his opinion more often, he will simply be more bewildered, more bored, and more ready to follow along. Lippmann's views were not isolated. Professor Woodburn referred to ignorant and irresponsible voters, and the Cleveland municipal officer observed that the ordinary individual has little fitness to judge of the ability of a candidate for office. Croly shared Lippmann's criticism that La Follette's blizzard of elections prevented all but a small number of citizens from thoughtfully participating in them. He complained that the direct primary's efforts to keep power in the hands of the plain people had precisely the opposite effect, by affording the political specialist a wonderful opportunity to devote their time to nominating and electing candidates to these numerous offices. Rather than demoting citizens, as Lippmann suggested, however, Croly aimed to simplify the machinery of representative democracy, to align it with the reality of busy citizens possessing uneven knowledge and expertise. He recommended that only decisive decisions and choices should be submitted to the voter. Rejecting the approach of La Follette and his supporters, Croly reasoned that the way to make votes important and effective is not to increase, but to diminish their number. The authority and legitimacy of representative democracy would be protected and strengthened by submitting only decisive decisions and choices to the voter. Citizens would be better prepared, more engaged, and more likely to turn out in greater numbers for a small number of decisive battles between the parties. Croly identified 3 steps to recommit governance to Republican institutions by retaining the founding principle of popular sovereignty, as Jefferson and La Follette insisted, and incorporating government authority bolstered by improved administrative capacity, as Hamilton argued. Croly's first step was to anchor the accountability of governing elites in political parties and voting. The dependence of elected officials on winning or retaining sufficient votes is necessary for decisive action. He linked this electoral imperative with lawmaking and the national party's organized control over the legislative proposals. Party organization performs a great service, Ford insisted, because it locates power somewhere and assumes real responsibility for the behavior of government. Second, Croly argued that national political parties connected the method of representation to expert administration in a progressive democratic community. It inserted a centralized responsible organization into governing and producing efficient and responsible social policy. The cost of government in time, ability, training, and energy should fall upon the leaders of the organized political party and its members holding the reins of government rather than citizens with inadequate time and resources. Countering Jefferson and La Follette, Croly proposed that efficient representation based on using administrative agencies and officials was feasible under the watchful eye of national political parties, alert to the verdict of voters in the next election. Professor Ford similarly argued that reinvigorated political parties were decisive to promote good government. Third, Political parties were the proving ground to train and encourage leadership that would lead toward the national interest. A democracy, Crowley reasoned, should encourage the political leadership of experienced, educated, and well-trained men, but only on the express condition that their actions face the accountability of severe penalties for wrongdoing. Crowley looked to national political parties to generate leaders who connected electoral success with governing that advanced the broader public interest. Promoting equality and practicing racism. Alexander Caesar's meticulous historical account of voting rights traces the rolling back of the franchise to the period from the mid-19th century through the Progressive Era. Men and women across racial lines were deprived of the vote in response to the rising antagonism of the middle and upper classes toward wide access to the franchise. The backlash hit African Americans far harder. Their disenfranchisement was achieved with brutal violence and was far more severe. Progressives spoke glowingly in public about universal values. In practice, their reforms, perhaps unwittingly in some instances, benefited whites, villainized immigrants, and aided the South's embrace of a Jim Crow system of segregation and violence toward people of color. La Follette's crusade for the primary occurred in this context of disenfranchisement and racial antagonism, and, in certain respects, was subsumed by it. Political equality for whites and blacks. La Follette's commitment to the Declaration of Independence's promise and the Constitution's guarantee of popular consent and political equality animated his advocacy of direct primaries. It also propelled his support for civil rights. Growing up during the Civil War, he admired Lincoln for saving the Union and for freeing the slaves. The Wisconsinite campaigned with righteous indignation against the South, regularly insisting that the past of 1865 is no more to be forgotten than the past of 1776. The South's oppression of blacks, he argued, also set back the rights of whites by restricting their ability to challenge the Democratic political machine's ties to affluent whites. La Follette's support for civil rights was evident in his voting record. He supported legislation to create opportunity for black people, such as federal aid to Southern farmers. He also publicly lambasted lynching as an everlasting shame, the murder, he said, of innocent, God-fearing, law-abiding colored citizens. The NAACP and leading African-American leaders, like W.E.B. Du Bois, recognized La Follette's principled stand for civil rights and supported him. Many progressives, however, did not share La Follette's civil rights commitments. Some were outright racists and in position of enormous power. Woodrow Wilson outwardly embraced white supremacy. He publicly extolled the film Birth of a Nation, which exalted the KKK and promoted negative stereotypes of African Americans. Wilson also supported the segregation of federal employees. Many progressives were not explicit white supremacists, but acquiesced to it as the price for achieving what they considered more worthwhile priorities. Teddy Roosevelt's 1912 Progressive Party campaign distilled the division between progressive Southerners, who insisted on a lily-white party as the price of their support, and Northern reformers, including Jane Addams, who promoted social policy and women's suffrage, but failed to rank black rights as their highest priority. TR's campaign fit a pattern among Northern progressives. They did not share the racial animus of Southerners, but they seldom contested the increasing division of Americans into separate enclaves. In 1912 and 1924, the Progressive Party platforms loudly advocated for expanding American democracy through adoption of the direct primary and other reforms, and yet were silent about the rights of African Americans. The direct primary and white supremacy. The rules of politics are not neutral. For decades, white supremacists seized on the arrival of the direct primary as a helpful instrument to dull the impact of voters' color and dodge effective constitutional challenges. The white primary produced outright exclusion from the 1920s to the 1950s. In Southern states, after the Civil War, the Democratic Party dominated, and its primary decided who would hold office due to the political weakness of Republican candidates. Following the ratification of the 15th Amendment in 1870, African American men enjoyed the constitutional right to vote and were poised to influence elections. When the white vote split among a number of white candidates, black voters could become kingmakers or conceivably elect a black candidate. By excluding blacks from voting in the direct primary, white supremacists used it, according to a North Carolina newspaper editor, to keep white men united behind one white candidate. It also secured the Democratic Party's domination against challenges from candidates that rallied struggling whites. Southern white supremacists were also attracted to the direct primary as a strategy to effectively undermine the 15th Amendment. For many years, they argued successfully in courts that political parties were private associations that could discriminate by excluding African Americans. In short, the direct primary performed a double whammy. It disenfranchised blacks and, for several decades, dodged a pitched constitutional battle over the 15th Amendment. Legal skirmishes over the direct primary pockmarked the 1920s and 1930s and invariably favored Southern white supremacists. That started to change, however, with the Supreme Court's 1944 decision in Smith v. Allwright. This ruling eventually struck a mortal blow by barring political parties from using the direct primary to deny the constitutional rights of African Americans to vote. After this decision, South Carolina, Alabama, and Arkansas maneuvered to dodge the court's decision and continued to disenfranchise blacks. But a process started that weakened the control of white supremacists and altered the balance of power among racial groups, a process that would continue through the Voting Rights Act of 1964. As the white supremacist use of the direct primary was blunted and eventually stopped, La Follette's reform evolved into a mechanism for reproducing racial hierarchies within the U.S. constitutional framework and democratic procedures. It was more subtle, but still effective. The Voting Rights Act and other legal and political changes opened the door to greater black representation. The direct primary enabled candidates of color to unseat entrenched white legislators and increase the numbers of black representatives in America's national and state capitals. Even with this expansion of representation, however, racial disparities in the recruitment and election of presidential and legislative candidates remained. The proportionately lower representation of legislators of color compared to white officials is a product, in part, of the primary process that splits the black vote and favors candidates with more organizational and financial resources, as critics of the primary warned in the early 20th century. We explore these developments in later chapters. The Progressive Era, Limits and Constraints. Progressives have faced a century of withering and often conflicting criticism. Timid conservatives, overpromising schemers, or reckless redirectors of American political development. The legacy of progressive political reform defies one verdict, but a common theme weaves through the political reforms, and in particular, La Follette's direct primary campaign, the limits and constraints owing to misjudgments, resistance, and the shackles of the past. Radical agendas and legislation. Progressives are criticized for not seeking to transform gender and race relations. Instead of pursuing a radical agenda of government seizure of property and assets to achieve structural economic change, they responded to middle-class values and anxieties. They accepted the concepts of capitalism even as they worked to tame its excesses and intentionally left its edifice intact. For this group of critics, the progressives are flawed for what they never tried. Prominent progressives from La Follette to Teddy Roosevelt were practicing politicians committed to winning votes to secure office and pass legislation. They accepted as do successful Western politicians and effective reformers from most eras, the underlying social and economic structures. La Follette was clear about the starting point for himself and his colleagues. "I am not for a class party, or a party composed of organized labor and organized farmers and organized socialists." He practiced the arts of populism, but swore off organized strife for class or group control. The reform records of progressives and 19th century populists present dueling roles and records. The populists, the People's Party, and their allies, designed a radical agenda to form cooperative alternatives in agrarian communities, remove money power from the political system, and greatly expand the scope of government intervention in the economy and workplace. They were, though, locked out of the legislative process, and unable themselves to enact these proposals into law or build enduring and widely used programs. By comparison, the progressives battled to win elections and wield influence in state and national legislatures against the well-funded opposition of political machines and corporate trusts. They accepted as a matter of necessity the imperative of searching for allies, building coalitions, and appealing to citizens with differing values and priorities. By contrast, populists generated an agenda whose legislative success depended on progressives, and later, New Dealers, to rescue farmers, stabilize the financial system, and tackle other priorities. The curse of overpromising. A second group of critics take progressives to task for overpromising and failing to achieve their own objectives. They set out to remove the excesses of monopolies and political machines. But their efforts to break up monopolies and concentrated wealth stumbled, leaving the agenda to the New Deal to tackle effectively. On another front, reformers rallied behind the Hamiltonian vision of creating coherent national administration of economic and regulatory policy, but left a legacy of incoherence and fragmentation. A hapless giant that was tangled by multiple and competing lines of authority that crisscrossed the executive and legislative branches. The shortfalls of the progressive era are undeniable. Reformers like La Follette and others overpromised and undelivered. Yet this pattern is familiar to reform episodes. Reformers at the turn of the 20th century might arguably be faulted for erring more frequently or with greater consequence. But their counterparts during the New Deal and Great Society, as well as the presidencies of Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama, also required modifications, accommodations, and reversals. Falling short is not simply a verdict on reformers. It also speaks to their circumstances. Progressives confronted dense and widespread networks entrenched in local communities and states. Incomplete and partial initial outcomes were inevitable. The contemporary and historical commentary about the direct primary often neglects the intense, widespread, and effective opposition it provoked. Political entrepreneurs, like La Follette, pushed for a new opportunity structure, but collided with amply equipped state and local party networks. They also clashed with other progressives, who recoiled at the deleterious impacts of direct primaries on the authority and legitimacy of representative government and national institutions. While the direct primary is pervasive now, that outcome was not obvious by mid-century. It might well have remained marginalized in the battle for power and position, if not for the undercover operation in 1969 to 1970 that revived the primary without adequately considering the reasons it was stymied. The long shadow of progressives. A third group of critics blames the progressive era for contemporary ills. The policies and changes introduced by the progressives, an array of detractors charge, occurred at the pivotal point in the development of modern American government. The results are declared catastrophic. They push the nation down the wrong path and set the government on an unsustainable course. Instead of criticizing the progressives for what they did not seek to accomplish or failed to accomplish, the third line of criticism blasts them for the changes they did make and the disastrous consequences for our own time. Today's doubters of democracy skewer progressives for introducing a more elections approach. Progressives are guilty, critics maintain, of establishing primaries to radically redirect control over presidential nominations from elected officials and party officials and toward the electorate and activist base. Democracy's doubters illustrate the tendency to single out the progressive era as the cause of contemporary ills based on tenuous, elongated chains of effects. Blaming the direct primary on progressives ignores their opponents within their ranks that stymied it, as well as the institutional inheritances that limited their options and distorted their plans to reformulate American politics. Progressive warning to later reformers. Advocates of the direct primary during the past half-century have persistently ignored the perceptive doubts voiced by critics about its democratic pretensions from its start. The ready excuse of unanticipated consequences is not available to this group of reformers. The dreadful consequences of primaries over the past half-century were, in important respects, anticipated, if reformers cared to listen. Early 20th century critics of primaries singled out two features that would later metastasize in American government and politics. The political rationality of the direct primary. The effect of the direct primary, Crowley and others cautioned in the early 20th century, is to splinter voters into factions, proliferate their formation, and motivate candidates to cater to them. Where the party machine consults conflicting interests until a ticket satisfactory to the majority is agreed upon, the primary encourages schisms and the pleaders of specific interests and causes by making it possible for them to nominate candidates who cater to their positions as opposed to the wishes and wants of most Americans. For candidates, their drive to secure nomination was expected to motivate them to adopt policy positions and build a personal organization devoted to mobilizing these narrow factions instead of pursuing the broad, civic, Republican values heralded in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. In addition, Crowley and others warned, as outlined earlier, that structuring political participation toward incessant primary elections focused on the inner workings of political parties, which narrowed the interest and engagement of most citizens. Members of factions devoted the greatest attention to the internal party nomination process, while voters, without intense preferences or loyalty to an organized group, were less motivated to participate in a primary. They also cautioned that the primary reversed the effort by generations to design the rules of elite competition and voter behavior to steer candidates toward shared national interests, as they calculated the question, what is rational to win? The primary's design put a premium on the short-term objective of winning the nomination, instead of the longer-term process of organizing and engaging voters and broad coalitions around shared interests. The warnings of Crowley and others failed to deter La Follette and his allies. The puzzle is that primary advocates both decried the pursuit of narrow, selfish ends by corrupt parties, while redesigning party nominations to channel politics into a labyrinth of rules and administrative processes. Why did their misgivings about parties fail to temper their enthusiasm for a reformed version of them? The answer lies in the progressives' faith in administration. The promoters of primaries trusted that the corruption of party machines would be checked by vigorous rules and procedures guiding the internal operations of political parties. La Follette and his allies championed the values of political equality, and yet designed a process that fostered disparities in political voice and representation. They claimed to create a bulwark against the ad hoc trading of favors by party bosses, but channeled citizens into a political process that controlled the terms of political participation and favored factions that wielded the substantial resources needed to track candidates, issues, and varying rules of eligibility. The authority and legitimacy of representative government. La Follette and other advocates fueled a spiral of attacks on the authority and legitimacy of representative government. They elevated unrealistic expectations of citizen control, which in turn triggered chronic disappointment with reforms that failed to deliver idealized democratic institutions and impassioned searches for elusive reform to achieve popular sovereignty. The effect was to hone political conflict on betrayals of untrustworthy democratic institutions, rather than on the fights over policy between parties, as Van Buren, Crowley, and others counseled. Why the direct primary was rehabilitated in the 1970s and reached its current heights is the topic of the next chapter. 5. Political elites and the failure to protect democratic institutions, 1960s to 1972. Nobody goes hungry. That was the ethic of William and Christine Mikulski's grocery store in the Highlandtown neighborhood of East Baltimore. It was an ethic that steered their daughter, Barbara Mikulski, to embrace a commitment to heal the sick and love thy neighbor. Mikulski credits her parents and Catholic education to her early social work career in Baltimore during the 1960s, and later pioneering career in the U.S. House and U.S. Senate, where she became the longest-serving woman in congressional history, 1977 to 2017. Mikulski's early career illustrates an era-defining disconnect between formal and practical politics in the 1960s, one that would shatter the mid-century Democratic Party and clear a path for the direct primary that progressive critics warned against. Mikulski wasn't political, nor a party person thinking about party politics during the 1960s. Yet she excelled at the basic skill of politics, organizing. She trained the poor and disadvantaged in the war on poverty's disruptive tools of maximum feasible participation to confront inequality. Although initially distant from electoral politics, Mikulski eventually challenged the unresponsiveness of the formal political establishment with the tools of grassroots politics and protest that she had honed as a social worker. Her impetus? A plan by the ossified Democratic Party in Baltimore City Hall to jam a 16-lane highway through her neighborhood on the east side and displace thousands of blacks and ethnics, working-class Polish, Greek, Lithuanian, and Ukrainian Americans. When Baltimore started to destroy row houses in 1968, Mikulski organized a coalition that brought it to a halt. After beating City Hall's highway scheme, she then beat it again at election time by knocking on 15,000 doors in her outsider campaign for a city council seat. Mikulski's infusion of grassroots organizing and resistance into electoral politics was not isolated, but part of a national pattern of popular protests in the 1960s. It successfully activated previously excluded youth, women, and people of color against entrenched political parties and unpopular policies, notably the Vietnam War and racial injustice. Mikulski's mantra of show up, stand up, speak up echoed the mindset of political organizers around the country who disrupted the established political system as a means to pursue social change. Grassroots political organizing was one of three discrete developments that intersected to catapult the direct primary from the sidelines of American politics to center stage. Even though it was not a priority of grassroots reformers in the 1960s and 1970, and was vehemently opposed by progressive-era commentators half a century earlier. The second element was the intensifying competition and division among political elites. Eugene McCarthy, Robert Kennedy, and George McGovern bristled at the barriers to their advancement to president. The selection of Hubert Humphrey by the Democratic Party's insiders crystallized their frustration and that of a new generation of political activists who reviled normal politics and the establishment's unresponsiveness on Vietnam, race relations, and other major issues. Seeking to placate the opposition to Humphrey's nomination at the riotous Chicago Democratic National Convention in 1968, the party approved a seemingly innocuous commission, which insurgent leaders would later seize. Under the direction of party chair Fred Harris and its first leader, McGovern, The commission advanced a concealed scheme to replace the party's candidate nomination process with direct primaries and dislodge Democratic power brokers in favor of new voices, youth, women, and people of color. Where protest disrupted the political establishment and created pressure for change, the division among elites opened space for alternative leaders to promote structural change and seize the opportunity for themselves. The third element concerns the content and direction of reform and the unexpected and ill-advised return to direct primaries to dictate party nominations in the 1970s. The advocates for the direct primary heralded it, as did La Follette, as expanding democracy and correcting the abuse of democratic assumptions by state and city Democratic Party operations that McGovern's commission identified. This chapter traces the revival of the presidential primary in response to the convergence of elite divisions and rivalry with institutional patterning. We begin by locating this unexpected turn in the conflict and elite rivalry of the 1960s that created an opening for sweeping change. America's sizzling cauldron. Bob Dylan was born and raised in northern Minnesota, and at 23 years old, put the comfortable in America on notice. The times they are a-changin'. For politicians steeped in the status quo, he presciently warned in 1964, "The battle outside ragin' will soon shake your windows and rattle your walls." The unraveling of America is how historian Alan Matisow described the flip from the social cohesion and insularity of an affluent white middle class in the early 1960s to the assault on the political establishment and onset of economic malaise. Disruption of the status quo in the 1960s contributed to the fracturing of governing elites and fiery divisions within America. Social and political fracturing. John Kennedy was inaugurated into an America on the upswing after the Second World War. Social historians portray a country with high hopes for the future and confidence in solving problems, including poverty and racial disparities, and reviving the world order in America's romanticized image. Americans, John Blum reports, exuded confidence in the superiority of their economy, their technology, and their weaponry. Rising standards of living and shared affluence among professional and blue-collar workers in the 1950s and 1960s propelled the growth of a white middle class with discretionary income. Princeton economist and New York Times columnist Paul Krugman describes this period as a fairly equal society in which economic disparities among whites were subdued, though black Americans remained disproportionately impoverished and lacking economic opportunities. The vast income and wealth inequalities of the Gilded Age had disappeared, and the poverty of the underclass was viewed as a social rather than an economic problem. As the well-being of Americans broadened and government revenues grew, a new generation of politicians and policy experts designed modest remedial programs and optimistically projected the prospects for social betterment. Poverty, racial disparities, education, juvenile delinquency, and other social ills became targets. John Kennedy's 1961 inaugural address famously gave voice to the idealism and hopefulness. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. The normally aloof novelist Norman Mailer gushed the new president was a Superman, instilling an unwilling charge to Americans. Then came the shots. The shock of Kennedy's 1963 assassination produced a startling turnaround for Lyndon Johnson, a Southern conservative who was on the cusp of possible indictment and replacement on Kennedy's 1964 ticket. Despite initial reservations from liberals, Lyndon Johnson's programs ignited their euphoria. A broad coalition of voters produced a landslide for Johnson in the 1964 election and swelled the Democratic majority in the U.S. House majority by 38 seats. The legislative tide for liberalism rose in 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the Medicare program for seniors, a historic education bill, and more. Even with the surge of liberal legislation, American politics retained a substantial degree of pragmatism across party lines, with Republicans joining Democrats on much of this agenda. On particular issues, politics remained largely consensual. That abruptly changed. Barbara Mikulski's revolt against the Baltimore political establishment was not an isolated incident. Protest and social disorder erupted for nearly a decade after the mid-1960s. Her searing speech at Catholic University in 1970 catapulted her to national prominence as an advocate of the 40 million blue-collar ethnic Americans who are victims of class prejudice. These hard-working citizens, she charged, are caught in a sizzling cauldron in which they pay the bill for every major government program and get nothing or little in the way of return. Meanwhile, earlier criticisms of American poverty, discrimination, and the nation's presence in Vietnam that had percolated on college campuses and among intellectuals, like Michael Harrington's sobering 1962 portrait of poverty, were seized on by people of color, youth, and women. It was a time of taking it to the streets, as the rock and roll hit put it. The streaming outrage of protesters against America's policies extended to what they saw as its shriveled democracy. The New Left charged, in the 1962 Port Huron Statement, that elections and traditional politics failed to penetrate institutions that were cordoned off from citizens. The alternative was outside the arena of elections. Participatory democracy, campus organizer Tom Hayden proclaimed, was the path to justice and to inspiring students and allies off campus. Lyndon Johnson became the target of the liberals, hippies, and New Left rebelling against the political establishment. For his part, the president was bewildered by the rejection of his strenuous efforts to liberate the poor and the black. Johnson deluded himself into believing that the backlash could be tamed by crafting misleading messages, targeted by White House public opinion polling. After securing landmark breakthroughs in social policy and civil rights, Johnson was unable to accept the poisonous effects of his Vietnam debacle, his deceptions to sustain it, and the cumulative effects on the political system's eroding legitimacy. The mobilization of the left spread off campuses into the country as the economy struggled and discord grew over U.S. policies. America's affluent middle class was staggered after 1966 by the Great Inflation, pushing the high cost of living to the top of Gallup polling on the country's most important problems. Even Johnson's legislative victories underscored limits rather than accomplishments in the eyes of liberals and social justice advocates. Passing the Voting Rights Act and other civil rights legislation were historic achievements. They also became targets for what they failed to do, end deep-seated racial barriers. Black communities revolted against the continuation of rampant discrimination, political underrepresentation, and clashes with police. The 1965 summer riots in Los Angeles' Watts neighborhood spread to cities across America in 1966, 1967, and 1968, displaying the fury of demeaned blacks and the long indifference of government. Johnson was cornered between these protests and the majorities of whites concluding that his administration was moving too fast on civil rights. The years of dodging demands for civil rights to sustain Southern white support for the Democratic Party, as President Kennedy had done, produced damaging political costs. The 1964 Democratic Convention in Atlantic City showcased the searing political conflict between the righteous demands of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, MFDP, for seats in the state's delegation and the state's racist Democratic Party establishment that excluded blacks and favored segregation. Johnson accepted a deal that refused to seat MFDP delegates in order to hold the South in the 1964 election, but committed to banning segregated delegations in 1968. Johnson, again, ended up with a no-win outcome. MFDP protests garnered damaging headlines, and the Mississippi white delegates that he did seat walked out in opposition to the party's civil rights planks. The Democratic National Committee adopted rules in January 1968 to ban racial discrimination, which were expanded in 1972. Vietnam accelerated America's unraveling as Johnson widened the draft. Television icon Walter Cronkite grimly announced the daily U.S. casualties, and U.S. soldiers bombed and massacred innocent Vietnamese people. The eroding support for Johnson's war started with liberal intellectuals, including MIT professor Noam Chomsky, disaffected students, and the New Left. It spread to growing numbers of Democrats and eventually the general public. Before 1967, Gallup polls show that stable majorities believed that sending troops to Vietnam was not a mistake, including 60% in August 1965 and 59% in March 1966. But opposition grew rapidly as the costs started to register. The economic costs of the war set up a damning choice: guns for Vietnam or funding for Johnson's Great Society programs. The deepening U.S. involvement provoked growing numbers of Americans to take to the streets and stirred escalating congressional opposition. For the first time, Gallup's July 1967 poll reported that 41% now thought that sending troops was a mistake, 52% disapproved of Johnson's handling of the war, and 56% concluded that the United States was losing the war or was stuck in an impasse. The eroding confidence in Johnson's optimistic reports on the war's progress accelerated after the Vietnamese Tet New Year in January 1968, when the forces battling America, the Viet Cong, surprisingly launched its largest military operation in over 100 towns and cities. Democrats turn on each other. As America's economy and confidence crumbled, and festering policy debates and rising distrust escalated into full-scale resistance, the Democratic Party split into unruly factions. The star Washington Post reporter David Broder bemoaned the open antipathies that developed within the Democratic Party. The party's leading figures are convinced that their enemies, always defined as Democrats of another faction, are about to succeed in cutting the party's throat. Hubert Humphrey's dilemma. Before 1968, Lyndon Johnson firmly led the Democratic establishment. As Johnson's policies provoked rising opposition in the country, the factions within the Democratic Party prepared a ferocious and debasing assault against his re-election campaign in 1968. Nearly 3 weeks after a surprisingly close primary win, Johnson abruptly ended his campaign during a nationally televised address on March 31, 1968. With no warning, Vice President Hubert Humphrey was thrust into the presidential campaign. Party rules and the tumult of 1968 trapped Humphrey in a paradox that was both seductive and toxic. Humphrey's nomination was advantaged by the establishment's continuing control over the nomination process after La Follette's ineffectual effort at change. But as Humphrey reached for his prize for assiduously following the party's long-standing rules, he enraged the discontented. Following Johnson's withdrawal, Humphrey stepped in to secure the political base that he had courted as a senator and then as vice president by meeting the requests of party leaders around the country and aiding mayors and governors in need of the administration's help. Humphrey's ties to organized labor produced commitments from nearly all delegates from Michigan, Ohio, and the heavily unionized states in the Northeast. Humphrey expected, as had presidential candidates for decades, to reap the reward of securing support from the national, state, and local party organizations. They continued to control the selection of delegates to national conventions. By 1968, only 38% of delegates were selected by primaries, with fewer even bound to specific candidates. The result? The party establishment chose nearly a third of the delegates before the 1968 primary elections even began, and Humphrey jumped to a healthy lead in the delegate count. Like prior presidential candidates backed by the party establishment, Humphrey skipped the primaries as unnecessary and risky. Wendell Willkie, the Republican Party's 1940 presidential candidate, entered the 1944 Wisconsin primary to overcome opposition among party leaders, irked by his cross-party wartime assistance to FDR. His large defeat in the Badger State ended his political career. Up next, Democratic Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee. Senator Kefauver leveraged his national fame from conducting organized crime hearings to win 12 or 15 primaries and over 3 million votes. Nonetheless, party leaders opposed Kefauver and selected his chief opponent, Adlai Stevenson, who received a mere 78,000 primary votes. Humphrey's losing primary battle with John Kennedy in 1960 left a searing reminder of the risks. Any man who goes into a primary, Humphrey concluded, isn't fit to be president. You have to be crazy to go into a primary. Even as the backing of party leaders convinced Humphrey in 1968 not to enter the primaries, several Humphrey advisers flagged the risks in a time of upheavals. U.S. Senator Walter Mondale, co-chair of Humphrey's 1968 campaign, Minnesota protege, and future vice president and Democratic presidential nominee, pleaded with him that he should run in the primary to be connected with the public and become their candidate. Although Humphrey sided with advisers who warned of the risk of running and losing or falling short of expectations, Mondale insisted that entering the primary was a risk worth taking and that it was a mistake to skip them. After the election, Humphrey would regret his decision to stay out. Humphrey's following of party rules that had been in place for decades secured his nomination. But in exchange, he absorbed withering criticism, not only for abiding by the process, but also for serving with the increasingly unpopular Lyndon Johnson. If Humphrey criticized the president or flagged in defending him, he risked losing the support of key party leaders, especially Johnson's loyalists from the South. Humphrey was cornered, and his campaign reeked of his predicament. Campaign journalist Theodore White reported that Humphrey's words, phrases, speeches sounded old and tired, and he delivered them with layer upon layer of reservations about policies he opposed that he felt bound to defend. For the first time, the once powerful position of being chosen by party leaders was a political curse, and Humphrey's allies ached for him. The vice president became a bullseye for critics of Johnson and long-accepted rules for party nominations. Forgotten was Humphrey's considerable record of championing redistributive social policies and civil rights, including his clarion call to delegates at the 1948 Democratic National Convention to get out of the shadow of states' rights and walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights. Mondale was galled by the lecturing to Humphrey about liberal causes, even though critics like Kennedy were late arrivals and less than reliable supporters of them. Historians later discovered, in White House archives, that Humphrey resisted Johnson's conduct of Vietnam, earning him the president's cold shoulder and venom. Prior to 1968, the likely presidential nominee approached the National Convention with stature and confidence, owing to party leader support. Not Hubert Humphrey. He arrived at the Democratic Convention scarred and embittered by 4 years of demeaning servitude to Lyndon Johnson and by the desertion and denunciation of his old liberal friends. McCarthy and Kennedy fight back. The mix of elite division, personal ambition, and popular unrest congealed in 1968 into a frontal assault on the Democratic Party's nomination process. Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy reflected and contributed to the split in the Democratic Party, leading contending factions that opposed the Johnson administration and the party's nomination process. Eugene McCarthy initially targeted Johnson before moving on to challenge his fellow Minnesotan Senator Hubert Humphrey after Johnson's withdrawal, and then assailed the party's nomination process. McCarthy brought an iconoclastic persona to the political stage, He combined hard-charging barnstorming and cutthroat competitiveness with a fascination for poetry and mysticism that baffled colleagues and reporters. At various junctures, he himself worried that his campaign speeches more resembled poetry than decisive campaign statements. McCarthy's unorthodox style leveraged 1968's countercultural moment to wage a punishing challenge to his Senate colleague. McCarthy became a rallying point for liberals and large university audiences of disaffected youth opposed to the Johnson administration, especially its Vietnam policy. Upon launching his campaign in November 1967, McCarthy decried America's deepening moral crisis and the administration's handling of Vietnam, charging that it was afraid to negotiate with America's adversaries in North Vietnam. McCarthy shocked the political world in the March 12, 1968 New Hampshire primary, the first in the country, by winning the moral victory of 42%. Against the sitting president, Johnson received 49.6%. McCarthy's startling result was aided by the low expectations prior to the election. Polls registered his support as only 10% to 20%. McCarthy's success revealed Johnson's political vulnerability and the political path for a challenger. After New Hampshire and Johnson's withdrawal, McCarthy won the next primaries in Wisconsin, 56%, and Pennsylvania, 71%, and a plurality in Massachusetts. McCarthy's success stirred Robert Kennedy's private deliberations over skipping the primaries or challenging Humphrey and McCarthy. Kennedy opted for the against-the-odds path of entering primaries, as did his brother, to win over party leaders and break through at the convention. Beating Humphrey and McCarthy would convince the old-fashioned delegate brokers, White reported, that Kennedy was beyond doubt the man who would win the presidential race and do more for their local ticket in November. Convinced that McCarthy and Humphrey were vulnerable, Kennedy entered the primary battle for the Democratic nomination on March 16th. He remade his public persona to fit the moment. He jettisoned his privileged upbringing and place at the apex of political power as a U.S. Senator, Attorney General for his brother John Kennedy, and ruthless calculator, who resisted his brother's outreach to Martin Luther King during the 1960 election. Kennedy's new identity channeled those who lacked power and political voice: students, blacks, and the poor. Instead of disdaining street disruptions, he befriended radical student leader Tom Hayden. Kennedy's star rose as the primaries progressed. While McCarthy prevailed in Kennedy's home state of Massachusetts on April 30th, 49% to 28%, Kennedy won a string of 5 primaries from May 7th to June 4th, when he secured a potentially decisive plurality victory in California's winner-take-all contest. The next day, he met with his ecstatic supporters in a large hotel ballroom and, with growing confidence, promised to go on and win the nomination at the Chicago Democratic Convention. Moments afterward, Sirhan assassinated him. Tragedy mixed with upheaval and protest in 1968. As the country buried Kennedy, only a few months after Dr. Martin Luther King's death, Humphrey and McCarthy withdrew from campaigning for several weeks. The rules marched on. As America mourned Kennedy's assassination, the long-standing rules of assigning delegates for the Democratic nomination proceeded unabated, with Humphrey gaining many of Kennedy's delegates. Oregon's Republican Senator, Mark Hatfield, concluded in June that McCarthy had no chance of stopping Humphrey's nomination in 2 months. As predicted, Humphrey won the Democratic Party's presidential nomination on the first ballot. While political insiders accepted Humphrey's steady march to the nomination as following long-established rules, supporters of McCarthy and Kennedy vibrated with an outrage supercharged both by grief and opposition to the Johnson administration. McCarthy won a plurality of primary votes, 2.9 million votes, or 39%. Yet, he lost the nomination to Humphrey who received about 150,000 votes, but 67% of delegates. McCarthy's delegate count amounted to 23%. The president of the leftist organization Students for a Democratic Society was enraged that the assassinations of King and Kennedy was followed by the embrace of Humphrey with his incredible debt to Lyndon Johnson and everything that was corrupt and sick about the Democratic Party. The frenzied politics of 1968 crystallized in an extraordinary challenge to the Democratic Party's nomination process. A commission chaired by Iowa Governor Harold Hughes and inspired by McCarthy's supporters documented what it described as the undemocratic conduct of state Democratic Party leaders in allocating candidates. In addition to unilaterally selecting delegates before the primaries started, state party leaders disproportionately steered the distribution of delegates toward Humphrey at McCarthy's expense. For instance, the New York Democratic State Committee selected 50 of the 65 delegates to reward allies. Its chair matter-of-factly explained that he would face a revolution if he ignored the people who helped me with the organization work and appointed strangers just because they're from McCarthy. The Connecticut and Kentucky parties heavily tilted delegates toward their favorite candidate, Humphrey, and provoked the McCarthy delegates to the state conventions to walk out in protest. A year later, the DNC's McGovern-Fraser Commission would confirm this pattern in 17 hearings around the country. In Missouri, the governor selected the National Convention delegation on his own. Iowa's Democratic Party granted McCarthy 8% of its delegates, even though he received 40% of the support in the state's caucuses. Although 880,000 blacks lived in Florida, its Democratic Party entirely excluded them from its executive committee for a century, and only a few were selected as delegates. The Hughes Commission converted these long-standing practices into a political harpoon directed at the Democratic Party. The practice of party officials running their party, a concept widely accepted in other representative systems, was labeled undemocratic and a threat to social order by a commission supported by a losing candidate's campaign. State systems for selecting delegates to the National Convention display, it charged, considerably less fidelity to basic democratic principles than a nation which claims to govern itself can safely tolerate. What started as the grievances of a losing candidate took on broader and more ominous meanings at the Democratic National Convention. The people, the thugs, and the Democratic Party. The breakdown of the old politics of interest, balancing, and reconciliation exploded on national television at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in August 1968. In the lead-up to the gathering, the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, and protest organizers castigated government policies as unrepresentative of the interests of vast numbers of people, and ridiculed Humphrey's nomination as unrepresentative government. Their bitter disdain was displayed by Yippie leader Jerry Rubin's nomination of a large pig named Pegasus as the Democratic candidate. The remedy, they declared, was filling the streets with protesters and practicing democracy in action. They chanted, "The party belongs to the people," and "The streets belong to the people." The police riot. The Democratic Party's internecine battles and protests may have faded in significance without the fuel of Chicago's police riot, as an official investigation about the events described it. With Mayor Richard Daley's city government denying permits for peaceful gatherings of what they described as meddling outsiders, demonstrators amassed and mayhem ensued. Police responded by firing volleys of tear gas with weapons supplied by the U.S. Army. When protesters fled, the police gave chase with batons raised high over their heads to crack against skin and bone, while some chanted, "Kill, kill, kill," according to a Chicago Daily reporter. With the police completely out of control, everyone became a target: demonstrators, clergy, journalists, and innocent bystanders. Police supervision broke down, and some cops removed their nameplates and badges to avoid later discipline. Playing out during an unusually hot August, the police assaults and fleeing crowds produced a satanic smell of rotting, cloying meat and unwashed clothes and bodies. The violence and odors permeated Chicago. Humphrey's hotel shower filled with tear gas, and McCarthy's hotel rooms were converted into a makeshift medical unit filled with bleeding demonstrators. The Chicago police and their master, Mayor Daley, supplied a face for the New Left's depiction of America's authoritarianism. Ruling as the all-controlling political boss that La Follette reviled, Daley directed the police not to go easy on protesters and to shoot to kill arsonists and maim looters. To impose his will, Daley assembled 40,000 officers drawn from city police, state National Guard, 5,000 U.S. Army troops equipped with flamethrowers and bazookas, as well as 1,000 federal agents. The mayor transformed the Democratic Convention into Fort Daley and encased it in barbed wire. Billy clubs, tear gas, and mace was Time magazine's contribution to the news media coverage. Walter Cronkite reported to The Nation that the police who assaulted his colleague, Dan Rather, were thugs. And Theodore White described the convention as a contagion of madness and a sickening loss of control. Novelist Norman Mailer likened the police assaults to a scythe through the grass, cutting a channel, while fellow fiction writer William Styron relayed the scene of police knocking down a young man and beating him senseless, nominated in a sea of blood. The chaos and bloodshed in the streets, and the media's visceral coverage of it, had political reverberations. The protesters seized on the spectacle of police brutality, chanting, "The whole world is watching." Daley became a target of stinging rebukes, and the police retaliated against journalists for covering them. "The word is out to get newsmen," several cops acknowledged. At least 20 reporters were hospitalized. Reformers in the country, like Barbara Mikulski, struggling 700 miles east to open up politically ossified Baltimore, were appalled and recommitted to changing the Democratic Party. Police riots on the streets of Chicago ignited the warring factions inside the convention hall. At Daley's instructions, security forces patrolled the convention floor to muffle critics of the Vietnam War by seating them far from the stage and physically abusing them, including the jackbooting of 14 New York delegates off the floor. The heavy-handed tactics enraged delegates and attracted the attention of reporters, beaming the proceedings to the country. Carrying a copy of the hated New York Times was enough to stop a New York delegate from gaining entry to the convention. The pandemonium on the streets fired up a second front, the political scrum over the nomination. Supporters of McCarthy and Kennedy fought to seize control of the convention from party regulars and block Humphrey's nomination. McGovern, who stepped into the nomination battle as a successor of Kennedy, hammered the Democratic Party for the street carnage. Even after the convention adjourned, McGovern pressed for an investigation into American youth being savagely beaten by police simply because they were protesting policies about which they have had very little say. As Humphrey fought off a challenge to his nomination by his rivals, he faced a third front, Lyndon Johnson. Humphrey feared that the president might repudiate him at the convention. Johnson harshly criticized Humphrey to party officials and sabotaged his Vietnam peace plank on the party platform to bring Democrats together. The cruel irony is that McCarthy's supporters were incensed by the president's attacks on him and mistakenly assumed that Humphrey was responsible for an extension of a non-existent Johnson-Humphrey plot. Humphrey prepares for Nixon and makes concession to protesters. Presidential conventions are designed to unify the party and slingshot candidates into the fall campaign. Not so for Hubert Humphrey. Humphrey's closest advisers surveyed the damage in Chicago and concluded it was a mean convention that humiliated the Minnesotan and left him a wreck. Theodore White gloomily summed up Humphrey's decline from a vigorous liberal champion to a puppet of the old machines, nominated in a sea of blood. Thinking ahead from the August convention to the November elections, Humphrey and his advisers worried that Chicago might be their wake, or funeral, that protesters prophesied. Years later, Walter Mondale agreed, blaming the convention for Humphrey's loss to Nixon. Pouring salt on the wounds of the staggered Humphrey was the refusal of McCarthy, his fellow Minnesotan, to follow tradition by rallying behind his party's nominee and supplying fulsome support following the convention's decision. Humphrey's stalwarts blamed McCarthy for their razor-close popular loss to Richard Nixon. 500,000 votes out of nearly 73 million ballots, or 0.7%. While Nixon ultimately scored a large electoral college margin, 301 to 191, the outcome hinged on California, Ohio, and Illinois, which the Republican won by 3 percentage points or less. In August 1968, Humphrey and his team were far from conceding. They maneuvered to revive his prospects against Nixon. One strategy was to bring together the party's warring factions by proposing new initiatives on race and Vietnam. With little to show for their efforts, though, Humphrey's team reached for a spur-of-the-moment compromise with Governor Hughes and his supporters. Before the convention, Hughes and his colleagues converted their criticisms of the 1968 primaries into a scathing report, The Democratic Choice, that revived America's tradition of equating democratic decline with political parties. Harkening back to La Follette and progressive reforms, the report declared a crisis of the Democratic Party and linked it to a broader crisis for democracy in America, and especially for the two-party system. Hughes and his allies pressed for open public participation in selecting convention delegates and ending the control of state and local parties. At the convention, Humphrey supporters on the influential Rules Committee initially blocked the Hughes report because it was the work of an unofficial, largely self-appointed group of McCarthy supporters proposing radical changes in the convention rules, in the words of Texas Congressman James Wright, Jr. Wright and other delegates did leave open, however, the possibility of careful and sympathetic consideration of a future party commission. Faced with the prospect of no progress, Hughes and his supporters rallied behind a proposal to create a commission to study reforms to increase popular anticipation in the selection of delegates to presidential conventions and submit a report at the 1972 gathering. On the 1968 convention's last day, it approved a commission to study the party's nomination process to identify steps to welcome members and ensure that delegates to choose a presidential nominee must reflect the up-to-date views of the members. The motion from Governor Hughes indicated that the commission would undertake to assure that all Democrats of the state will have meaningful and timely opportunities to participate fully in the election or selection of delegates and alternatives. Most convention delegates approved the commission as a seemingly harmless gesture to throw liberals a bone and respond to the mayhem on the streets. Democratic powerhouse Ann Wexler underscored another reason for the convention's approval of a commission that would later trigger a monumental move to direct primaries. The presumed innocence of the proposal and distractions outside the convention hall meant that there was no organized attempt to stop it by Humphrey or the party leadership. As the fall campaign commenced, and Humphrey searched for ways to energize his campaign, he trumpeted his support for a reform commission. He urged the party's chair to proceed quickly with starting its work to develop recommendations to maximize democracy in the nomination process. Revealing his motivation, the Democratic nominee stressed the importance of recruiting members who were particularly concerned about the criticisms leveled by McCarthy's backers and the Hughes report. Humphrey's strategy of using party reform to soothe the ire of McCarthy supporters, Kennedy mourners, and street protesters repeatedly failed. The convention adoption of a commission was hardly noticed, or was assumed to befall the well-known curse of studying a well-known problem. Indeed, the prospects for the commission rested on a series of long-shot twists. The Democratic Party appoints the commission. It recruits open-minded members instead of known reform opponents. The commission and party adopt recommendations that genuinely respond to the scorching criticisms in the Hughes report. And independent state parties transform their selection of delegates. Under normal circumstances, each one of these should have derailed the 1968 convention's closing decision. The unexpected happened, however. Humphrey never got a bounce from his conversion to party reformer, but his sop to reformers created an opening that would transform the form of American democracy. Subterranean reform. Following the Chicago Convention and Humphrey's close loss to Nixon, an undercover reformer, Fred Harris, one of Oklahoma's U.S. senators, a rising young star in the Democratic Party and co-chair of Humphrey's campaign, launched a surreptitious plan. His scheme would transform participation in the presidential nomination process and shunt aside the national and state party establishment and its allies. Harris's quiet coup poses two puzzles. The first is Harris's success in imposing concentrated costs on the people and organizations with the power to stop reform, while promoting the purported interests of a diffuse and largely unorganized group of citizens and dissidents with little institutional influence. Second, the Democratic Party returned to the internal mechanism, direct primaries, that progressive reformers savaged as a threat to democracy half a century earlier. While Harris's plan may have failed at another time, he pushed for change during a powerful convergence. Popular discontent created a rhetorical arsenal for Harris to exploit. Elite divisions weakened the resistance of the Democratic Party to an organizational threat. And political ambition motivated presidential hopefuls to invest their reputations in promoting reform with uncertain consequences. George Wallace's populist appeal to racial resentment in the 1968 presidential campaign won 13.53% of the popular vote and reinforced Harris's inclination toward reform that would create a path for incorporating, and presumably defeating, these discordant factions. The quiet coup. A miscalculation by Humphrey gave Harris's covert operation an opening. Under pressure from Harris, Humphrey rewarded him for his leadership of his presidential campaign with a position as chair of the Democratic National Committee, DNC, over the strong objections of his advisers. Power brokers like Max Kempelman warned Humphrey that Harris was a mistake and would hurt the party because he was driven by his own personal goals and couldn't be trusted on the important issues of the party. Mondale agreed. He also warned that Harris's interest in reforming the DNC was to position himself as a great reformer to pave his way to the presidency by offering new leadership with a different flavor following the 1968 convention. Under normal circumstances, Harris's rush at the party organization to promote himself as the chairman of reform would have been repelled by well-positioned state and national Democratic leaders determined to protect their bases of support. His ambitious inside job, however, exploited the power vacuum following Nixon's victory and Humphrey's withdrawal. He stalled resistance by concealing his intentions and welcoming the misconception that only modest adjustments would be made to improve fairness. Nobody understood Harris's plans. His DNC executive assistant marveled until he said it out loud following his appointment. Even then, his goals were vague and made it difficult, as Mondale observed, to find out the commission's position other than they wanted reform. Harris's ruse misled not only Humphrey, but also groups that bore the brunt of Harris's deception, national and state party leaders and labor. Once appointed in January 1969, Harris made two decisive organizational moves. First, Harris carefully selected commission members who would support reform of the party's structures and not provoke a damaging backlash that would put a harsh spotlight on his radical intentions. He excluded party leaders and marginalized a critical Democrat ally, organized labor by limiting its representation. Mondale, who was sizing up his own presidential prospects, was alarmed that the names of the commission were fast walked through and left out labor leaders like Bill Dodd from the auto workers, whom Mondale considered indispensable to the Democratic Party. Mondale worried from the commission's outset that Harris was aiming to change rules without regard to the party establishment. Even as Harris started to outline his objectives in general terms, few Democratic power brokers stood up to his still vague vision of reform. With little pushback, he exhorted commission members to create the most open and representative party ever. And Vice Chair Hughes recommended shifting power from the small group of men who run the Democratic Party to all of the party's members, from the precinct to the national convention. Second, Harris surrounded himself with a carefully selected and close-knit cabal of staffers who were party insurgents and shared his radical agenda to widen substantially public participation and disrupt the established party organization. He recruited key staff from the Hughes investigations who had cataloged the flaws of the Democratic Party's nomination process during their scrutiny of its treatment of McCarthy, wielded a nearly unrivaled familiarity with reform proposals, and shared a firm commitment to structural change. Mondale's initial worries deepened as he came to appreciate that Harris and his staff disdained regular party politics and traditional party constituencies, like organized labor. Political ambition propelled not only Harris, but also George McGovern. The sitting U.S. Senator and eventual 1972 Democratic presidential nominee similarly latched his presidential hopes to establishing credentials as a bold reformer and weakening the party establishment that opposed him. His push to substantially expand public participation opened the doors to his intense and devoted backers and well-organized grassroots campaign to secure the party's nomination in 1972. While McGovern may not have anticipated the rapid adoption of presidential primaries, his disruption of long-standing Democratic Party nomination rules neutralized party opponents and advantaged his grassroots campaign strategy. The staff takeover. The commission's staff enjoyed a lopsided advantage in motivation and expertise. Members of the commission devoted little time or attention to its work. They were tied down by full-time jobs and met only intermittently before the report's public release in April 1970. "I must admit," the staff advisor professed, "I was amazed at the way the commission let us run things without lobbying in advance or any calling back and forth between members. There was only us." Even if commission members engaged and tried to steer its work, the staff was equipped with a coherent agenda, expertise, and the latitude to frame the group's questions and pose alternatives to advance structural reform. Theodore White's description of runaway staff is fair, but incomplete. Their plans followed Harris's map and were overseen by the commission's chairman, George McGovern, and, after he announced his presidential campaign in January 1971, Minnesota Congressman Don Frazier. The staff capitalized on the disconnect of commission members to fundamentally redesign the party's presidential nomination process. The result, according to Byron Schaefer, is that the overwhelming share of the document going out to publication was effectively identical to the draft document prepared by staff for the Commission's August 1969 meeting. In total, the Commission made minor adjustments to the staff's work, added a guideline to the report's initial 17 core guidelines, and deleted none of its recommendations. The Commission members' disinterest had repercussions. It preempted public attention and debate that their disagreement would have triggered among the general public and state and local party leaders across the country. It was a sequestered and hidden process. The Commission's detachment unleashed the staff with the extraordinary latitude to overturn the party's process for presidential nominations and, in time, reshuffle the political system. Commissioners did not approve of these drastic changes, but failed, as a group, to challenge or even understand the impact. The trio of DNC players, Harris, McGovern, and the staff, sidestepped a familiar hurdle to transformation: effective resistance by organizational interests facing diminished power and resources. They disrupted the long-standing presidential nomination process by capitalizing on divisions among party elites and allies, and welcoming aspiring presidential candidates to promote it to serve their own political interests. The return of the direct primary. The Commission's adoption of the presidential primary proceeded in 3 phases. Step 1. The Commission blitzed national and state party establishments with calls for Democratic renewal that summoned Jefferson's and Jackson's indignation and the pointed complaints of La Follette. The problems encountered in Mayor Daley's city were indicative, the Commission charged, of the sickness that infected state party operations around the country and routinely produced delegates that are not chosen in a democratic manner. The path forward, according to the Commission report, Mandate for Reform, was to return to democratizing internal party operations. The aim, it vowed, was to strengthen our party and American democracy and regenerate the Democratic Party as a more responsive and dynamic servant of the American people. The report claimed to channel the New Left's call for participatory democracy and the ethos of citizen mobilization embraced by Barbara Mikulski. The Commission steered the party's administration of nominations toward embracing the maximum participation among interested Democrats in the selection of National Convention delegates and creating popular participation and popular control of the Democratic Party. The purpose of this deeper engagement, according to McGovern, was to assure that the people, rather than the bosses, select the presidential nominee. The reform cabal directing the DNC seized on the tumult of Chicago to undercut recalcitrant national and state party officials. Failure to open the door to participating in the choice of the Democratic Party's presidential nominee, it cautioned, would threaten the party's survival. Worse still, inaction risked the country's stability by steering people committed to orderly change toward the anti-politics of the street. That is, the bedlam at the 1968 Democratic Convention. The Commission strong-armed state party organizations to comply with its dictates. Mandate for Reform, which was approved in November 1969 and implemented in 1970, commanded the adoption of these guidelines by all states, and defined its recommendations as the minimum action they must take to meet the requirements to attend the 1972 convention. As part of its process of implementation, the Commission's staff issued 465 violations by states, along with a checklist of failings and the necessary changes to comply. Every state was called out for at least 6 shortcomings. Many received far more. The effect: entirely repudiated over half of all state plans for delegate selection. State Democratic parties treated the DNC's 18 guidelines as posing a dire choice: reform or face rejection by the next National Convention's Credentials Committee. The intended effect was to preempt state resistance, public scrutiny, and debate that might have stalled reform. Despite the state acquiescence, the DNC's guidelines were not binding. McGovern and his staff bypassed the normal authoritative roles of the National Party and the next convention. States were herded by the Commission's exaggerated claims of sweeping authority to require compliance and mete out punishment. Step 2. Deploying artful deception, the Commission's leadership and staff pressed states to change, but without insisting on the adoption of specific new mechanisms that might spark a backlash. On the one hand, Mandate for Reform took aim at common practices by state parties. It called for the elimination of party caucuses and the delegate primary, while requiring that the names of presidential candidates be on the ballot. The delegate primary featured contests among individuals seeking to become a delegate to the National Convention. Today's primary elections feature the names of the candidates for office, with those winning a certain number of votes securing delegates committed to them. A longtime state power center, state committees, were limited to controlling only 1/10 of the delegations to the national conventions to select presidential nominees. On the other hand, the commission counted on state and local parties to behave as strategic actors. The state chairs had more important fish to fry at the state level than they saw for themselves in the squabbles over presidential nominations. Accepting presidential primaries to skirt a potentially costly battle with the DNC was a reasonable trade. The selection of presidential candidates was already nationalized and slipping out of the hands of state party organizations. Without a specific directive, states accepted national presidential primaries to preserve their power over what mattered most to them: control over district and state caucuses and conventions. The finesse by McGovern and the staff held off resistance from commissioners. Many of its members favored reforms of conventions and caucuses that would expand participation. By not specifically recommending presidential primaries, the artfully crafted commission guidelines traded on the detachment of commissioners and averted opposition. While the commissioners were oblivious of their own report's recommendations, the staff anticipated that states were likely to choose the presidential primary. Through their work for Hughes during the 1968 nomination contests, the staff was well acquainted with candidate selection mechanisms. Once the commission eliminated the methods that states most widely used to choose delegates, the staff projected that primaries had a strong potential to emerge dominant. What else could the states use that was familiar and available? Step 3. The adoption of presidential primaries by Democratic state parties rapidly spread across the country, with the Republican Party generally following along after 1972. The GOP was not driven by the elite divisions and ambition that propelled Democrats. Indeed, renegades like the party's 1964 presidential candidate, Barry Goldwater, found openings. The impetus for the GOP was state laws, passed by mostly Democratic legislatures, and the lure of media coverage, which favored Democratic candidates battling in the 1972 primary races. With both parties conducting presidential primaries, the number rose rapidly from 15 in 1968 to 27 in 1976 and 37 in 1980, where it has hovered a bit higher or lower, depending on the competitiveness of presidential nominations. Because of the adoption of primaries to replace party control, the proportion of delegates chosen by primary elections to both party conventions more than doubled, from about 40% in 1968 to 94% by 2020. The primary produced a fundamental shift in political power and America's incentive system. The adoption of primaries flipped control over the selection of national convention delegates. Nearly 3/4 were chosen through the state mechanisms of caucuses and conventions in 1968. Primaries selected almost 3/4 by 1980. Within a decade of the McGovern-Fraser Commission, the winner of primaries became the presidential nominee. Politicians looking for a successful career in politics took note. Primaries and race. The Democratic Party's reforms occurred in the context of expanding rights to vote since World War I and pitched reactions against it. Women won the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, nearly doubling the size of the electorate. The determined movement for the rights of African Americans precipitated civil rights legislation and judicial decisions, which created national democratic rules that removed nearly all the formal restrictions on the franchise. As the McGovern-Fraser Commission was issuing its recommendations, the United States, formally at least, had something very close to universal suffrage. The clash over recognizing the democratic rights of African Americans was etched into the Democratic Party and became a rare flashpoint on the DNC Commission. At the 1968 Chicago Convention, Southern delegates fought the party's steps to make good on the commitment in 1964 to integrate future delegations, as promised to Fannie Lou Hamer and the Mississippi Freedom Democrats. Georgia's state party chair recoiled at the seating of civil rights leader Julian Bond and an integrated delegation, concluding that the white conservative vote in the South is not wanted by the present leaders of the Democratic Party. Speaking for a previously segregated white party, James Gray pronounced that, "We all feel sore and battled and have a score to settle." True to his word, 5 of the state's most powerful Democratic politicians followed through by leaving the party after the 1968 convention. Meeting just a year later, the DNC Commission became another site of America's dueling racial orders. The guidelines issued by Mandate for Reform directed states to send delegations to the National Convention that included minority groups, young people and women in reasonable relationship to their presence in the population of the state. The Commission's commitment to explicit demographic targets and increasing the participation of groups that had been underrepresented precipitated ongoing strife. On the Commission, the policies to reverse the Democratic Party's history as a white organization stirred one of the few pointed disputes among commissioners over what would be described as quotas. This dispute burst into the public eye, with the demographic targets slammed for imposing reverse discrimination. At the 1972 Democratic National Convention, Chicago Mayor Daley exploded at the replacement of 59 Cook County delegates with an alternative slate to meet the new requirements for diversity. The fracas over race coincided with Barbara Mikulski's jump from neighborhood organizer and Baltimore political newcomer to national politics. Mikulski's 1970 speech in favor of shaking up the Democratic Party brought her national attention and an invitation to serve on, and eventually chair, a new Democratic Party commission in 1973. Its mission? Retreat from the imposition of mandatory quotas and fixed quantitative ratios by granting states the flexibility to design plans to encourage full participation by all Democrats, with particular concern for minority groups, women and youth in delegate selection and in all party affairs. Participation by blacks and women would decline in the next convention, though still stand above prior levels. The Democratic Party's halting, fractious, and prolonged acceptance of civil rights coincided with a search for an alternative Democratic coalition. Starting in the early 1970s and continuing for decades, the party aspired, with uneven results, to build a new political force from the previously marginalized women, youth, and people of color. The coalition included liberal political organizations, such as Americans for Democratic Action and the National Women's Political Caucus, as well as established reformers from inside government. Political history and blundering political elites. Fred Harris, George McGovern, and their staff succeeded where La Follette failed a half-century earlier, establishing presidential primaries nationwide. Keen observers of protest-induced reformism credit the reforms to the populism and civil disorder of the 1960s and Chicago's riotous convention. The protests did persuade delegates to the 1968 convention to approve a commission on the nomination process on its last day and supplied a rhetorical arsenal for McGovern. Beyond these influences, though, the tangible impact was limited. The protest account emphasizes the significance of citizen agency, and yet the consequences of the reform to establish primaries curtailed citizen influence by favoring factions and undercutting the participatory democracy that the New Left proposed, as I suggest in the next chapter. Moreover, the 1968 Chicago protests and the later DNC reforms are correlated without a causal connection. Neither the records of the Commission's decision-making nor interviews with commissioners and senior party officials present persuasive evidence that the civil disorder exerted a discernible influence on the tangible decisions. Elite-level dynamics account for the adoption of primaries. Divisions among Democratic Party elites fatigue from the taxing presidential nomination battle, and the close loss to Nixon created an opening for reform. Humphrey's withdrawal after the demoralizingly close loss to Nixon and his ill-considered decision to appoint Harris DNC chair ceded power to upend the party organization. Inattentiveness by national and state party officials and organized labor, aided by Harris's strategic ambiguity, removed a potential check that would have previously blocked the transformation. Indeed, Humphrey's stewardship and the veto by the party establishment were anticipated by many delegates at the 1968 convention, who nonchalantly approved a commission on nominations. In the vacuum after the 1968 elections, ambition filled the void created by elite disarray. Harrison McGovern calculated that advocating reform and winning the backing of party liberals would translate into advantage in a competitive and divided field of presidential candidates in 1972. McGovern did successfully capitalize on the open structure he created to win the 1972 Democratic nomination, before losing in a landslide to Richard Nixon. By contrast, Harris's ambition to build a political career came to naught. Within a short period, new people replaced him, and he was old news in a couple years. The DNC reformers engineered structural change against the odds. But why did they choose the particular design of a direct primary? Prior accounts of primaries assume that it was a foregone conclusion because of the effectiveness of progressive reformers in establishing them. The reality, however, is that La Follette's agenda to establish primaries throughout the country was defeated by progressive-era opposition. From the perspective of mid-century, the McGovern-Fraser Commission's reform was not a foregone conclusion. If reform occurred, there were options that did not entail eviscerating the Democratic Party organization. For Mondale, parts of the Democratic Party were autocratic. But Harris and McGovern were wrong that everyone in the Democratic Party were corrupt, backward, and bankrupt. The party organization contained some of the country's best people, who achieved civil rights and other progressive breakthroughs. Sensible reform of the Democratic Party, he suggested, should have focused on strengthening these elements rather than weakening the party's organization. While the adoption of primaries was not foreordained, the maneuvering by Harris and McGovern for thoroughgoing changes left them searching for feasible options. The institutional patterning since the early 19th century set the parameters for reformers when it coincided with crippling elite divisions and soaring political ambition. Harris and McGovern's makeover of the Democratic Party's nomination process failed to consider the tradition since the Republic's birth of designing institutions to protect democratic representation and restrain elites. Harris and McGovern sought to reinvigorate American democracy without corralling, as Madison and Crowley did, elite ambition to serve broader interests. The consequences undermined rather than advanced political equality and popular sovereignty, as we discuss in the next chapter. Part 3. Reviving American Democracy. The proliferation of primary elections since the 1970s precipitated, in conjunction with other developments, a sharp turn toward instability and hateful polarization. The first priorities to restore democratic resilience are to check irresponsible, ambitious politicians and bolster community participation within a system of political representation. 6. The ills of primary elections and democratic deformation. How did a country that produced the foundations of mass democracy become its fire pit? Donald Trump is a shrill warning of the fragility of American democracy. But he alone is not the problem. The vulnerability is broader and deeper. Trump's supporters stormed the Capitol on January 6, 2021, after the president implored them from near the White House to walk down to the Capitol with a challenge. "You will never take back our country with weakness." Trump's agitation of the crowd of more than 10,000 added to the provocations of previous speakers. The call for trial by combat by his personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, and the threat to disloyal Republican members of Congress that "we're coming for you" from his son, Donald Trump Jr. Centuries of eloquent proclamations about the elevated virtue and responsibility of the governing class were mocked by Trump's defiance of the Constitution and, just as telling, the acquiescence of Republicans in Congress. Even after Trump's supporters invaded the Capitol, 147 Republican senators and representatives followed Trump's instructions and voted not to affirm Biden's Electoral College victory, despite the dictates of the Constitution and law. The repudiation of the law was compounded by the kind of demagoguery that would have alarmed James Madison and other authors of the U.S. Constitution. Trump and congressional Republicans roused their party's loyalists by spewing falsehoods about voter fraud in the 2020 election that were disproven by voter recounts, signature verifications, and the rulings of more than 60 courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court, with 3 justices nominated by Trump. 70% of Republicans accepted their groundless charges, and Trump's mischief solidified his standing as far and away the top choice for the GOP's presidential candidate in 2024, years before the election arrives. Following the throng they helped manufacture, Republicans in Congress and in legislative districts turned on GOP lawmakers who voted to affirm Biden's win and called out Trump's conduct. Representative Liz Cheney was targeted with the most public initial retribution. House Republicans stripped her of her leadership post in May 2021. Her response cut through the swirl of misinformation. Trump is intent to unravel the democracy to come back into power. The threat to American democracy is not primarily from aberrant individuals, as initially compelling as Trump's and Wallace's messianic personalities may appear. The faulty structures of politics are the root cause. In the most immediate sense, the robust adoption of primaries in the 1970s is responsible for the rise of Trump, despite clear indications, before his nomination, of repudiating American democratic rules, procedures, and norms. The primary equipped Trump to speak to voters on a uniquely visible public platform, clear the barriers to ballot access by having his name placed on state tickets across the country, and secure a major party's label with its legions of loyalists. With the nomination in the hands of primary voters, the Republican Party and its leaders lacked the institutional tools to stop Trump in 2016 or another Trump candidacy if he decides to run for a second term. Trump was not the first renegade candidate to use primary elections. In 1972, Alabama's racist governor, George Wallace, was a front-runner for the Democratic Party presidential primary before a would-be assassin sidelined him. He followed a script similar to Trump's, in a crowded field with establishment figures, including Humphrey and Maine Senator Edmund Muskie, and candidates favored by party activists, including Shirley Chisholm and McGovern. Wallace's messages stood out for, often teetering along the razor's edge of violence. Like Trump, he appealed to the grievances of financially vulnerable and politically disaffected white voters. Siding with the average man, he targeted the media, pointy-headed intellectuals, and the political establishment, ominously warning the National Democratic Party to watch out, because average citizens are going to run you over, to take our party back, because it belongs to us. Wallace, like Trump, received extensive free media coverage for sensational statements and actions. Both were also intensely opposed by nearly all the party leaders, but they were powerless in the primary system to stop them. Wallace's strident anti-establishment populism won 37% of the delegates in 8 states. The eventual nominee, George McGovern, won only 19% of the delegates in these states. Although the shooting of Wallace pushed him out of the campaign, he stunned the Democratic Party by winning more than 40% in 5 states, Florida and Michigan included, 30% in 2 more, and over 20% in 2 additional states. Because of its deformed political institutions, America now faces the recurring threat of anti-regime presidential candidates. Like wolves in the forest, searching for weak prey, ambitious politicians are gearing up to present themselves as Trump 2.0, and racial nationalists are recruiting renegades to reprise the strategy of Trump and Wallace. Primaries present a dire threat, but they are also an expression of more deep-seated and momentous perils. The authority and legitimacy of democracy have eroded to critical levels. Political inequality based on organization and race is now embedded in political structures. Political campaigns aimed at agitating racial resentment are increasingly common and prominent in defining political divisions. Primary elections either gave rise to each of these or augmented already existing impulses. Now, efforts to alter America's calamitous direction face towering obstacles, including a deformed understanding of democracy itself. Heroic narratives of American history, politics, and its great leaders collide with a record of actions and developments that endanger American democracy. This chapter begins by revisiting the previous chapters to identify the barriers to changing the current course of American politics. It then catalogs the damaging consequences of primaries for political polarization, political inequality, entrenched racial disparities, and erosion of democratic authority and legitimacy. Barriers to change. American democracy is at risk. Yet change is obstructed by three sturdy barriers. The urgency of reform will not, on its own, produce needed reform. The construction of an idea of democracy. The words of the Declaration of Independence are familiar today, but were startling to many in 1776. Its brazen pronouncement that everyday people had rights, including the right to govern themselves, astonished Europeans, where most lived under monarchs and in societies topped by aristocrats. A dozen years later, the French Revolution's Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen modeled itself on the Declaration of Independence and its recognition of equal rights and popular sovereignty. While leaders of revolutions embraced democratic rights, the ratification of the Constitution commenced the work of integrating values into institutions. Few were as influential as Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in shaping the founding of the Republic and expressing unease with the potential of political parties to foment dangerous factions. Yet Jefferson's defeat at the hands of John Adams in 1796 motivated the pair to reverse course and embrace political parties as their weapon to instigate a revolution in mass voting. Expediency eclipsed earlier principle, and Jefferson was rewarded with the White House in 1800. Andrew Jackson later swaddled himself in Jefferson's legacy by strengthening the mass mobilizing capacity of the political party and extending the influence of the people to the selection of presidential candidates. Jefferson's turn to parties and Jackson's move to open up the party nomination process set the parameters for reforms by subsequent ambitious politicians. La Follette and the later duo of Fred Harris and George McGovern, who instigated the wide adoption of presidential primaries starting in 1972, similarly linked democracy with political parties and the responsiveness of its nomination process. The democracy nomination formulation continues. Bernie Sanders revived the populist appeal for a political revolution that would protect an American democracy of one person, one vote, and reach the millions of Americans who have become disillusioned with our political process. He aimed his populist fire in 2016 on state Democratic parties. He ripped the Nevada party that used its power to prevent a fair and transparent process from taking place. He described New York's closed primary that barred independents and Arizona's long lines as absurd and undemocratic processes and an embarrassment to American democracy. In 2016, Donald Trump used Sanders to amplify his complaints. I watched Bernie winning primaries, he told a Rochester, New York audience in April 2016. Then I see he's got no chance, because the system is corrupt, and it's worse on the Republican side. The GOP unfairly distributed delegates to Ted Cruz, he complained. I'm up millions of votes on Cruz, and I'm only up by about 200 delegates. He tied these charges of a fixed and corrupt system to his populist pitch to give voice to the forgotten men and women of America. We live in a democracy, he charged, but the system is rigged against our citizens by the bosses. The complaints by Sanders and Trump are the normative byproducts of an understanding of democracy that has been constructed over time. The recipe is familiar. Ambitious politicians tie their political prospects to castigating internal party mechanisms as failing to satisfy a peculiar American idea of democracy. The reality, however, is that primary elections repudiate the seminal democratic standard of political equality. Because participation is limited to the better educated, established, and organized, primary elections obstruct equal political activity among citizens and discourage lawmakers from providing equal consideration of the preferences and interests of all citizens. The false notion of democracy is a daunting barrier to altering primaries. Reforms to equalize political voice by altering the nomination process perversely face charges of subverting democracy. Institutional design and political rationality. Over the past half-century, Washington political analyst Norm Ornstein pioneered reforms of campaign finance laws and more with both Democrats and Republicans. Yet the January 6th insurrection and prior months of Trump's baseless charges of voter fraud provoked an outburst against reformers in the GOP he had relied upon as responsible problem solvers. Trump, Ornstein pointed out, benefited greatly as major figures within his party failed to offer a different version or act to counter his destructive behavior. Instead, responsible Republicans and former collaborators, Senators Bob Corker, Jeff Flake, and Rob Portman, pulled the plug on running for re-election rather than facing a potentially bruising primary to help the GOP revert to a right-of-center problem-solving party and stop a xenophobic cult of personality. Ornstein was particularly disappointed in Portman, who surrendered a career in the executive and legislative branches as a serious statesman on pension reform, global trade, and budget deficits. After not voting for Trump in 2016, Ornstein called him out for acquiescing to the president's style and program. Ornstein's Republican disappointments are products of the primary system and illustrate three mutually reinforcing dynamics that cow even those who know better. The new brokers of power. Office holders follow the policy goals of the new brokers of nomination under threat of punishment. With the weakening of party as a filter to nomination after the 1971 reforms, the political vacuum was quickly filled by a new network of party activists, organized groups, and donors who intensely embraced liberal and especially conservative policy demands. New political groupings also developed, the opportunity to exert influence in a receptive political arena, along with courting by ambitious candidates, enticed advocates, from born-again evangelicals to environmentalists, to become active. Primary electorates, Gary Jacobson explains, are much more partisan and prone to ideological extremity. Candidates, in turn, adjusted to the new rules by embracing the policy demands of the new networks that controlled nominations, even though they constitute small minorities within their party in the country. Candidates who were not initially hard-edged partisans or ideological were replaced by more amenable politicians, especially immediately following the DNC reforms, or converted to the policy goals of party activists. Jeff Sessions felt the primary sting. He was a prominent Republican senator who was among the early Trump supporters in 2016 and was rewarded with the position of Attorney General. But Trump turned on him when he followed Department of Justice policy by recusing himself from Robert Mueller's investigation of the Trump campaign's possible collusion with Russia. Trump exacted revenge by endorsing Sessions' challenger in the 2020 U.S. Senate primary, political neophyte and football coach Tommy Tuberville, who won by over 20 points before cruising to a similarly large general election victory. Within this system of incentives, it was rational for formerly principled Republicans to capitulate to Trump's perilous conduct and his loyal following. In contrast to Trump, Biden ran as a favorite of the party organization and not as a threat. Party factions played a role, however, in both of their nominations. The Democratic nomination featured a sharply drawn conflict between cliques devoted to electability and defeating Trump and those committed to progressive ideological principles. The first three state nomination contests in January and February 2020 were won by the moderate Pete Buttigieg, and most impressively, the progressive favorite, Bernie Sanders, who thrashed Biden 46.8% to 20.2% in Nevada on February 22nd. After Nevada, political observers were harshly critical of Biden's campaign and were preparing to declare his candidacy doomed. Biden prevailed, however, because of his earlier successes in the invisible primary, when he built a formidable coalition of activists, former leaders, and influentials in the Democratic Party, large donors from party allies, and a plurality of African American voters. Sanders' support among progressives and small donors was notable, but not enough. Biden's advantage among party factions registered in the fourth primary on February 29th, when he scored a 29-point win in South Carolina. With this demonstration of his core strength, his competitors among moderates withdrew, and the Delawareans settled into a straightforward and winnable contest with Sanders. The effectiveness of a policy-demanding network has produced a Republican Party that is nearly saturated with conservatives. Voters and office holders in the Democratic Party have become decidedly more liberal, though differences in its membership's aims and institutions are more pronounced than among Republicans. After party activists and their allies used primaries to enforce fealty to their policy demands, successful primary challenges based explicitly on ideology have generally become less common than they were after 1972, though the Tea Party and, more recently, progressives spurred upticks. The potency of punishment by primary remains because of anticipation of retribution. Politicians rarely defy fealty to party activists and their allies. Defending the turf. Power brokers of candidate nominations fiercely defend their institutional positions against reform. Party activists denounce any weakening of influence as akin to an unconscionable selling out of party values, while interest groups and donors fight to defend their inside track to advancing their policy agendas and securing favorable government regulations and funding. Faced with threats to the survival of their influence in politics, they respond with an intensity that is difficult for reformers to match. Deploying democracy to defend political inequality. Elected officials and organized interests defend the primary system as democratic, to deflect criticisms or proposed reforms. Righteousness linked to self-interest is a powerful barrier that rallies allies and misleads the casual observer. In short, the primary system is highly resistant to change. The normative claims about primaries are married to the mutually beneficial interests of the party activists and their allies, as well as politicians elected in the current system. While McGovern and Harris wanted to open up Democratic nominations, the effect of the primaries has been to entrench a narrow set of factions and their political loyalists. The dangers of misguided political elites. Edmund Burke famously made the case for citizens deferring to elected officials. Talking to his constituents in Bristol, England, in 1774, Burke painted an alluring picture of office holders who were guided by the duty to exercise mature judgment and enlightened conscience without sacrificing them to you, to any man or any set of men. Burke's sympathizers traced the failures of American politics to democracy and its violation of his Bristol guidance. Primaries are attributed to the more democracy illusion and demands that there is a democratic imperative to expand opportunities for citizen participation and control. The reality is quite different, however. Primaries and the ensuing vulnerability of democratic institutions result from the competition and ambition of political elites. Jefferson, Jackson, La Follette, and McGovern each collided with the political establishment and turned to reforming political parties to secure a path to greater power. Their self-serving calculations initiated and reinforced a pattern of reform that loaded the dice for the faction favoring primaries. They hid their tracks by seizing on populism as a pretext to unsettle the political establishment and mobilize support for them as the vehicle for reform. Elites ignored or bypassed warnings. Herbert Croly's prescient cautions during the Progressive Era that primaries would proliferate divisive factions and undermine the authority and legitimacy of representative institutions faded with time. McGovern, Harris, and their staff deceived members of their commission and the broader Democratic Party about their intentions to demolish important organizational capacities in order to implement their plans. Lost was the preoccupation since Madison with designing electoral institutions to reward candidates with good character and erect filters of candidates hostile to the Constitution and rule of law. Progressive-era critics warned precisely that primaries invited pestiferous demagogues and brazen-faced men of a lower type of character who relied on false and divisive public appeals. The skill set to win presidential nomination via a primary, strident public appeals, and a knack for cutting deals with factions replaced the older pattern of showcasing good character and building support in state and national networks. As predicted, the primary opened the door to anti-regime candidates. Wallace was the first. Trump was the most effective, exploiting the communicative power of the presidency to project the most disruptive messages of any predecessor. Trump's approach bears a haunting resemblance to European right-wing authoritarian populists like Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who took advantage of economic insecurity, demographic change, and immigration to rally supporters against democratic institutions. The survival of American democracy may depend on urgent reforms, and yet the primary system creates daunting obstacles. Worse, the consequences of primaries have made these barriers still higher. The consequences of primaries. The Democratic Party's commission to examine party nominations produced the reconstitution of the total matrix of institutions for presidential nomination in the National Democratic Party. The revolution of political party nominations contributed to 5 extraordinary consequences. The presidential primaries that McGovern launched were rarely the single and direct cause of these complex and multifaceted components of contemporary America, but they opened a path for their development by both weakening the filter of party organization that previously dampened them and motivating politicians and groups to exploit new opportunities. Enabling partisan polarization. Today's extraordinary partisan polarization is a byproduct of the direct primary, along with the emergence in the 1960s and 1970s of salient civil rights issues. Of course, the polarization of American politics is not a simple story with one explanation. Primaries inserted civil rights into nomination contests. The widespread adoption of primaries, starting in 1972, coincided with the arrival of new issues, disagreements, and cleavages. Congressional Republicans were decisive supporters of civil rights legislation in the 1960s, but the leadership of Presidents Kennedy and Johnson and subsequent partisan division on implementing the new laws imprinted the Democratic Party as the primary champion of racial justice and prompted voters, especially in the South, to reconsider their mainly inherited partisan devotions. Primaries created a new forum where political activists, organized groups, and donors were able to insert the new issues and divisions at the center of candidate competition for nomination to a degree that was not typically possible when political bosses controlled the nominations. The issues of race, along with social and religious concerns, became increasingly aligned with visible left-right thinking and partisan divisions among politicians, and in time, the electorate. Over a period of time, the interplay of primaries, advocates of liberal or conservative policies, and ambitious candidates for the presidency and Congress had a momentous impact. Consistent ideological polarization across economic, social, and racial policies replaced shifting differences on a few issues, as was the case in the past. Public opinion surveys show that individuals with conservative attitudes towards social welfare policy, think Obamacare, race, and cultural issues, such as abortion, now reliably affiliate with the Republican Party. Americans with liberal views on these issues have become the core of the Democratic Party. The sorting of political parties based on ideology changed voting patterns. Most states in the South and Near South elected conservative Democrats into the 1960s. Now they are Republican strongholds, though the 2021 Democratic Senate wins in Georgia may suggest change. States in the North that elected moderate and liberal Republicans in the past are increasingly Democratic. Exit polls on Election Day routinely reveal that 9 out of 10 Democrats and Republicans vote for the party with which they identify. Two profound shifts have occurred during the past half-century. Each political party became more internally unified. The liberal Republicans of the 1960s, like New York's Jacob Javits, are gone, and conservative Democrats have mostly faded as well. As this ideological cleansing occurred, both major political parties diverged from the other, becoming more polarized than at any point in the past. Empirical research confirms the impact of primaries. My research with Penny Thomas and Ling Ju examined the empirical impact of presidential primaries on the ideological polarization of presidents. Studying the period 1952 to 2000, we found that the increasing numbers of primaries produced immediate and continuing effects on presidential polarization in the years following the McGovern-Fraser recommendations in 1971. The pattern of presidential candidates moving further apart on policy after the robust adoption of primary elections in 1972 did not exist before the McGovern-Fraser Commission's recommendations. In the period 1952 to 1968, presidential primaries had no statistically significant impact on polarization. Our findings suggest, then, that primary voters are pulling candidates to the left, and especially the right. Frequently studied additional influences on polarization failed to consistently matter. Two riddles are posed by the primary-fostered polarization of elected officials. Riddle number 1. Why aren't voters tossing out office holders who are more liberal and conservative and rejecting the choices presented by party activists? Most Americans hold comparatively moderate attitudes toward policy issues and governing. For instance, everyday Americans, including Democrats and Republicans, favor what activists detest: compromise. This was evident during the first few years of the Trump presidency. Republicans used their majorities in the U.S. House to pass bills that repealed Obamacare and aimed to restrict funding for Planned Parenthood, while most Americans favored more moderate positions. 58% of Americans preferred politicians who compromised, rather than rigidly held to their ideological positions. Riddle number 2. Americans favor moderate attitudes toward government policies like health reform, but they are hostile and distrustful of individuals in rival political parties. Why are Americans agreeable on policy issues and furious at rival partisans? And no, Donald Trump is not the original cause. Rancor preceded him, though he fanned it. The bonding of voters to political parties is the key to answering these riddles. Let's start with riddle number 1. Voters are not removing extremists from office because they have sorted into loyal partisan teams. Instead of the old hodgepodge of liberal and conservative ideologies and split-ticket voting, liberals more consistently reside within the Democratic Party and conservatives in the GOP than half a century ago. Primaries facilitate the odd pairing of partisan polarization and public moderation. Party activists and their allies, especially in the GOP, use their control over nominations to put polarized choices in front of voters during the fall campaign, even though the mass of voters is moderate and in agreement on broad policy goals. Unpacking riddle number 2 brings us to a series of fundamental questions. Who are we? What do we believe? And who is in our group? The center stage gladiator match between political parties cements their dominance as a political identity. Saying I am a Republican tells you what policies I likely favor, as well as how I define myself in the world in which I live. As our parties polarized, and Americans are fed a steady diet of Joe Biden squaring off against Republican leaders, or Donald Trump pitted against Democrats, our political identities have increasingly diverged at a deep level. It now defines our psychological makeups and generates feelings of intense dislike. Racial resentment by GOP loyalists, fed by Trump's white protectionism, intensified these shifts and racialized the partisan polarization. Primaries are the psychological equivalent of Friday night booster events for the home team. Presentations by primary candidates articulate variations on common themes and activate emotional connections to their party, despite disconnects on policy. The in-group experience that contributes to the social polarization of political identity is rewiring our judgments, behavior, and emotions. The result? Psychological and emotional loyalty to party resembles the devotion, and at times, fanaticism of sports fans for their team and against opposing teams. Reinforcing political inequality. For generations, America embraced the principles of political equality and popular consent, even as it denied these rights to slaves as well as Americans of color and women. Congress and the courts since the 1960s have nearly swept away formal restrictions on citizenship rights. But primary elections sustains racial and economic disparities, inviting the practice and mindset of factions. The institutional form of primaries is hostile to the practice and understanding of political equality and popular consent. It instills among elected officials and citizens the narrow or group interest mindset of faction, instead of the embrace of the common good that John Rawls envisions. The language and maneuvering integral to primaries are constrictive rather than expansive. The result? Politicians, observers, and the media conceive of the American electorate as sliced into narrow lanes in order to win the support of competing segments of party activists, groups, and donors. As government officials adopt this standpoint, Rawls warns, they openly skew their attention to the factions that control their renomination. Talk of shared interests, values, and principles are uncommon, and action based on them rarer. Everyday citizens and the unorganized struggle to find themselves in a conglomeration of squabbling factions. In addition to cultivating a factional mindset, primary elections enable, reinforce, and heighten the organization of bias that has long favored the organized and well-resourced. Turnout is low, typically a half or less of general election participation. As a result, party activists and the most loyal partisans are overrepresented in primary elections. The impact of factions in primaries is further amplified by organized groups and donors who devote money and resources to capitalize on the opportunity to steer Democratic and Republican nominations. What has the practice and mentality associated with primary elections meant for the government's attention to citizens? In the decades after the Second World War, the Democratic and Republican parties competed to respond to the policy preferences of the majority. Ambitious politicians appreciated that advancing their careers depended on pleasing the median voter at the midpoint of public opinion, and party leaders who focused on winning elections. The result was that both parties gravitated toward agreement on salient policies, from expanding New Deal programs like Social Security, protecting the environment, hat tip to Richard Nixon for historic steps on both, and bolstering national security, hat tip to the Carter-Mondale administration for pioneering stealth technology and cruise missiles. As primaries disciplined ambitious politicians, their policies often responded to party activists and their allies, rather than median voters. This has contributed to persistent gaps between government policy and the preferences of citizens. Everyday citizens exert little or no impact on the decisions of presidents and members of Congress. Not surprisingly, 56% of Americans in a 2021 Pew Recent Center study reported that elected officials do not care what ordinary people think, compared to 32% in Germany. Donald Trump simultaneously fanned public distrust and favored insiders. He hyped Washington as an unresponsive swamp and the American system of representation as not a democracy, but a rigged and very unfair system. As if to prove his point, he closed deals among Republican and conservative factions to cut taxes to benefit corporations and the best off, and attempted to repeal health coverage from the uninsured and inadequately insured, and strip protections of Americans with severe health conditions. Lopsided majorities of Americans opposed these and other policies. Only 30% or so expressed support for the tax cuts, and 2/3 or so opposed the Trump administration's attempt to strip protections against pre-existing conditions. Deceiving swing voters. A relatively small number of independent-minded voters may tip control of Congress or the presidency. Skillful politicos turn to several tactics to simultaneously abide by the agendas of party activists, groups, and donors, while still appealing to the decisive set of swing voters. Presidents and members of Congress work hard to disguise decisions that are at odds with what most Americans prefer by relying on the complexity and obscurity of the legislative process and government policy. Congressional leaders are magicians in engineering votes that leave no fingerprints to trace to unpopular decisions. President Trump, for instance, struck at one of the most popular features of Obamacare, prohibiting insurers from denying coverage due to pre-existing medical conditions through a relatively obscure Justice Department legal filing. Another tactic of deception: politicos under the direction of cold-blooded and highly paid political consultants use polls and other methods to identify words, arguments, and symbols that simulate the false appearance of responsiveness. In the run-up to the 2020 elections, Trump increased his support among voters of color compared to 2016 after modulating his attacks on Latinos and accenting Biden's authoring of the 1994 crime bill that added to the mass incarceration of African Americans. Presidential use of public opinion surveys started long before Trump. Richard Nixon conducted image studies to analyze voter perceptions of him and tested, along with Reagan, the popularity of competing presentations of administration policy. White House message testing led, for instance, to Reagan's description of his expansion of U.S. nuclear weapons as peacekeeper missiles. Barack Obama promoted the passage of health reform with a promise that polled well, but was not feasible. If you like your health care plan, you can keep it. Bottom line, the empowering of narrow factions with enormous power has motivated politicians to turn to deception as a routine matter. Primaries are not solely driving American politics, but they created a new institutional environment that favored the growth of new interests, political activists, and issues supported by insiders, stakeholders, and narrow factions. Diverting democracy. The passionate denunciations of elite corruption from Jackson and La Follette to McGovern were twined with promises to tame political parties by lashing party nominations to a labyrinth of rules and legal mandates. This administrative impulse is not unique. It fits a familiar American pattern in the responses of reformers to the concentrations of economic power during the Progressive Era, market breakdowns during the Great Depression, and the Great Society's attention to inadequate education, illness, inaccessible medical care, and more. The Democratic and Republican parties now routinely issue decrees that spawn, along with court rulings, elaborate, often arcane strictures that route disputes over candidacies and policies into debates over internal practices. The corralling of political participation into highly structured and elaborate processes has three effects. First, the smart political strategy calibrates the investment of money and candidate time and messages to serve the short-term objective of winning a fast-approaching election. The outcome is familiar. Campaigns are laser-focused on a discrete pool of frequent voters, groups, and donors who already share viewpoints and interests and have the highest probability of lending support. Online communications have accelerated selective short-term mobilization. As primary elections concentrated political engagement among a relatively small number of activists and voters, Democratic and Republican candidates calculated that it was a rational allocation of limited resources to underinvest in politically disaffected or intermittently engaged citizens who sit out elections. The flip side is the calculations of elected office holders. Catering to the activists and voters who frequently participate is worthwhile. Attending to the interests and preferences of infrequent voters receives attention, but is considered an unwise target for large investments. Second, U.S. primaries focus political energy, as no other democratic country does, on year-long inter-party contests that magnify comparatively minor inter-party differences in contrast to the momentous divide between parties. By comparison, intra-party disputes are important in European political parties, but take a back seat to the competition over broad themes between distinct parties. With a focus on inter-party disputes, organizations of mass-oriented political parties and trade unions mobilize everyday citizens, including people who might otherwise be inactive. Rather than the selective mobilizing that takes place in America, European parties encompass a broader range of interests. Third, the 18th-month process of quietly recruiting staff, donors, and party activists, followed by the grueling 6-month primary season, consumes massive organizational and financial resources that might otherwise be available for organizing citizens and encompassing associations. Bernie Sanders ran in the 2016 and 2020 Democratic primaries as a proponent of revolution to inspire activism among long marginalized groups. But his campaigns and the $228 million he raised in 2016 and the $211 million in 2020 were siloed toward the inner workings of the Democratic Party. Building a broad, encompassing organization of citizens, including many who were disaffected, was not a priority because Sanders' fight for power was channeled within the narrow confines of primary battles rather than sustained community organizing. Primaries channel political participation into the inner administrative processes of political parties. Primaries divert resources and political focus from organizing citizens, including the disaffected, which we flag in the next chapter as valuable to restoring American democracy. The direct primary and reconstituting racial orders. America's celebration of Jefferson and Jackson for creating democratic revolutions is tainted by their complicity with the subordination of women, as well as the enslaving, murdering, and oppression of African Americans and Native Americans. This contradiction is rooted in the contending racial orders of white supremacy and egalitarianism. The battle of old Jeffersonian ideals against white supremacy continued with the introduction of primary elections. Bruce Kane attributes the advent of the primary with expanding citizen democratic opportunities. While that was La Follette's stated aim, the white primaries diminished the democratic rights of Southern blacks by protecting Jim Crow segregation. Until the mid-20th century, the persistence of explicit racism in the Democratic Party's nomination process produced the exclusion of Freedom Democrats in 1964 from the Democratic Convention in Atlantic City in favor of Mississippi's all-white delegation. Yet, as the formal apparatus of white supremacy was pulled down by Supreme Court rulings and civil rights legislation, primary elections created a unique platform to transmit messages of white antagonism to tens of millions. George Wallace used the primary to spew his racialized populism, and Trump employed it to stoke racial resentment by denigrating Mexicans as drug dealers, criminals, rapists, as well as demeaning other people of color. The primary gave Trump and Wallace the singular opportunity to reach tens of millions of voters with their messages and gain access to the ballot with the incomparable political payoff associated with a major party's label. Descriptive representation has increased, but the election of black candidates remains partial. Because of racial polarized voting, the preponderance of African American legislators were elected from majority-minority districts. In the South, majority-minority districts accounted in 2015 for 95% of all Southern State House seats held by African Americans, 96% of state senator positions, and all of the seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. An only slightly less stark pattern is evident outside the South. The representation of Latinos from majority-minority districts largely mirrors that of African Americans. The elections of candidates of color have increased with partisan polarization, in which whites disproportionately vote for Republicans and people of color for Democrats. Since 2010, racially polarized voting has contributed to the increased election of minority candidates in districts where 40% to 50% of the electorate are voters of color. Outside majority-minority districts, candidates of color have only limited success winning white majority districts. The depressed representation of African Americans is not due to a lack of interest. African Americans are more likely to consider themselves qualified for office and consider a run for office than whites. The convoluted primary process contributes to the underrepresentation of voters of color. It puts a premium on recruitment, fundraising, and the power to clear out rivals. These practical limitations on candidates who are black, indigenous, and people of color favor white politicians and depress diverse political representation. Only 7% of U.S. House primary elections included an African American candidate between 1994 and 2004. The proliferation of factions is a factor in the underrepresentation of people of color. Even in majority-minority districts, African American candidates lose when the primary splits voters of colors, and white candidates are advantaged with superior organizational and financial resources. Without the organizational and financial resources to build effective political institutions, communities of color struggle to narrow the number of black candidates and prevent dilution of the black vote for African American candidates. Primaries not only invite voters of color to split their vote, but they also help whites avoid the same predicament. In some southern states, primaries use runoff elections when no candidate receives the majority of votes. While lacking the white primary's explicit racist intent, the runoff election has the effect of allowing white voters to coalesce behind a white candidate, when a candidate of color has done well in the primary. The tendency of primaries to proliferate factions has the effect of politically isolating black candidates and voters. The process segments candidates of color based on race, obscures their non-racial status as citizens, and interferes with evaluations of skills, experiences, and accomplishments that white voters consider when choosing among white candidates. Barbara Mikulski's iconic 1970 speech that spotlighted the plight of white ethnic Americans also called for an alliance of white and black. This soaring promise proved difficult as the electorate was factionalized and white candidates were advantaged by their racial identity, as well as financial and organizational resources. Depleted democratic institutions. James Madison engineered the Constitutional Convention in 1787 to establish the authority and legitimacy of government, including representative institutions. Madison's double-sided strategy controlled the direct expression of political equality that erupted in the 1780s and lay a foundation for representative rules and procedures, was extended by Jackson's political strategist, Martin Van Buren, who anchored representative institutions in the political party nomination process in the 1830s. The authority and legitimacy of representative institutions that Madison and others nurtured is now threatened by the primary system and the political dynamics it invites. Eroding consent of the governed. Madison listed enabling the government to control the governed as the first challenge of the new republic. He and his colleagues calculated that they could induce the consent of citizens through their belief in the fairness of elections and the legitimacy of transferring power according to a system of representation. America's belief in the founding principles of democracy, political equality, and popular consent are fraying. Following Trump's term, 2/3 of Americans describe politicians as corrupt. This scathing assessment is extraordinary among democratic countries. It registered in the 20% to 40% range in France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. Democracy is similarly disdained. 53% of Americans are not satisfied with democracy's operations, compared to 45% in France, 38% in the United Kingdom, after the contentious departure from the European Union, and 20% in Germany. The dismal view of American democracy does not appear to be fading quickly. Half a year after Trump's departure, 2/3 described it as threatened rather than secure. Partisanship fuels American distrust in the political system, producing a seesawing of political trust as control of the White House shifted. 66% of Republicans expressed political trust in 2017 after Trump's victory, compared to 49% following the 2020 election. Democrats swung in the opposite direction, from 42% in 2017 to 59% after Biden's win. This erosion is neither new nor are its sources singularly tied to primaries. Nonetheless, primaries intensify real-world conflicts, partisan polarization, and other such trends by creating a platform to blitz Americans with reports of corruption, rigged elections, and unequal treatment. Primaries invite cycles of recrimination in which candidates lacerate the process for its lack of democracy. Sanders, and more so Trump, savaged the party primaries as corrupt. A reform that was intended to promote democracy is now habitually flogged for its absence. Trust in democratic institutions and their authority to conduct elections fairly have lost their footing as a foundational element of America's civic culture. With primaries sharpening the edge of partisans, elections are now seen as rigged instead of neutral and trusted processes. During Trump's term in office, political trust in the fairness of elections seesawed as control of the White House changed. In the period from fall 2019 to August 2020, 67% up to over 80% of Republicans expressed confidence that votes would be counted correctly in the 2020 election. 2 months after Biden's inauguration, however, Republican confidence in the correct counting of ballots for the next election fell to 36%. 72% of Trump voters concluded that there was enough fraud to change the outcome. By contrast, the pattern flipped for Democrats, with confidence in vote counting jumping 13 points from fall 2019 to March 2021. Fraying restraints on political elites. Madison's knowledge of the experiences of states after 1776 and world history left him alert to the violence of faction, demagogues skilled at exploiting divisions, and the risks that fractious colonists might resist the peaceful transfer of power. The Constitution's response, in part, was to specify rules and procedures for deciding elections to facilitate the peaceful transition of power. George Washington left office in 1796, troubled that the baneful effects of factions could burst into a flame. One of the surprises of early American history, however, was the taking hold of regular transitions following the peaceful, though bitter, departure of John Adams after losing his rematch with Jefferson in 1801. Subsequent generations accepted the peaceful transfer of power and built candidate nomination processes that filtered out demagogues who might defy this tradition. Primaries have bypassed the check on the advancement of candidates who shun the constitutional and rule of law. The result is that Republican leaders were powerless to bar Trump from joining televised debates that projected his message to many millions, gaining access to primary ballots and securing the nomination. Primaries stripped them of the institutional position to stop Trump and his disdain for the Constitution and rule of law. Trump's threat to the peaceful transfer of power was a veritable checklist of Madisonian horrors. His fomenting of racial antagonism and demagoguing of election fraud whipped Republicans into a modern-day mob to support his challenges to democratic institutions by bending the rules and acting outside the law. He used this following to breach the much-touted system of checks and balances by corrupting Republican lawmakers to fall in line. Party loyalty became a covenant that produced support for Trump's mutinous actions. American narrowing and European broadening. America's resilience on primaries is exceptional. While more countries and parties use primary elections, the scope and influence of the primary in the United States stands out. The comparatively peripheral role of primaries abroad is reflected in its status as a party decision and not as legally binding. The U.S. reliance on primaries reflects broader differences in the nature of political conflict. Where the U.S. primary channels political conflict within each political party, the structure of European political party competition focuses on broad disputes between distinct parties. The orientation to inter rather than intra-party struggles put a premium on the encompassing organizations of mass-oriented political parties and trade unions to mobilize everyday citizens, including those who might otherwise be inactive. By contrast, the primary rewards factions and narrowly based political groupings. The result in the United States is that the mobilization to politics is more likely to bring in people who would otherwise be active, not those who would be otherwise inactive. America's loss. Where is America's much-praised civic culture, anchored in acceptance of the Constitution and the rule of law? The January 6th insurrection and support for a renegade president who encouraged it are glaring signs that polarization and the rising fury over political inequality, racial disparities, and political distrust pose a dire threat to American democracy. America's much-vaunted system of checks and balances lays in shambles. How can the clear and present danger to American democracy be fought off? 7. Renewing American democracy and restraining political elites. Preserving American democracy depends on a fundamental rethinking of political representation. The old idea is that elected officials beneficently speak for citizens, and that citizens should defer to them. A new and disturbing conclusion is unavoidable. The record of America's governing elite is scarred by avoidable mishaps and the instigating of insurrection. If American democracy is going to better approach its founding principles of political equality and popular consent, we need to revitalize citizens and reorient elite competition to restrain ambition and reward service to the common good. Restraining elites to check their abuse does not preclude their essential role in the democratic governance of complex societies. Busy work and private lives distract citizens from following many public issues, investing in skillful consultation and negotiations in a diverse society, and participating in public decision-making that requires intensive preparation. At a practical level, political representation relies on accountable doers who act. This requires divisions of labor, delegations of authority, and professional specialists with technical expertise to inform authoritative decision-makers and citizens. Experts are also an important source of innovative policy proposals and evaluations of government policies to identify their effectiveness. Moving toward a well-functioning representative democracy requires fortifying its formal rules and procedures and designing institutional reforms to invite and then channel strategic action by elites that enhances political equality. Equal political participation by citizens is a starting point for revitalizing American democracy. Political activity through voting, community organizing, and speech is what governing elites observe. With properly designed institutions, equal activity fuses the motivations of elected officials with responsiveness to broad publics. This chapter identifies the strains and breakdowns in the current political system that create opportunities to stabilize and invigorate American democracy. It begins by linking reform strategies to political and institutional constraints, and then identifies two imperatives for a strategically guided effort at reform: restraining elites and designing in broader and more inclusive and organized citizen participation. Thinking strategically about reform. The threats to American democracy and the thirst for renewal have generated a plethora of reform proposals. While many are thoughtful and well-meaning, some of the proposals are ineffective, or worse, contribute to political inequality. We need strategically conceived reforms that strengthen political representation as a fundamental component of democracy, restrain governing elites, and cultivate political equality. Get real. Revitalizing American democracy by turning the clock back to an earlier period or adopting alluring but risky efforts at transformation is neither feasible nor advisable. Protecting turf. The institutional pattern of primaries to select nominations defines the expectations, operations, and power of government officials, party activists, organized groups, and donors. Each one will intensely oppose efforts at transformational change as threats to its institutional position and power. Even reforms of the organizational biases of primaries face an uphill climb against America's misconceived notion of democracy, one that fosters political inequality and unresponsiveness. It is indicative of the faded legitimacy of American democracy that 73% agree that it was important for the national government to allow citizens to vote directly to decide key issues in place of legislators. This exceeds the sentiment in the largest Western European countries and reflects a Don Quixote syndrome, the enduring wish since the Declaration of Independence for thoroughgoing and never obtainable power by the people. America's quixotic pursuit of real democracy is on full display in the headlong rush to transform elections by adopting ranked choice voting, RCV, which allows citizens to rank multiple candidates until the weakest are removed, their votes reassigned, and a majority winner declared. It is attractive for eliminating primaries and fostering civility among candidates to avoid losing support from voters whose most preferred candidate is eliminated. As in the past, however, the enthusiasm for RCV may unintentionally further degrade American democracy by elevating political inequality. My research with Joanne Miller suggests that RCV in the 2013 elections in Minneapolis produced a pattern of higher political participation by those with higher income and education. This pattern is familiar to scholars of citizen political participation. Promising approaches to reform. A long line of political observers and academics has conducted a kind of parlor game of imagining epic reforms to cure the ills of American democracy. The election and near election of presidents who lose the popular vote has led to generations of proposals to scrap the U.S. Constitution's provision for an electoral college. Democrats and their allies have pressed to revisit the Constitution, to correct its allotment of 2 senators to each state. Their grievance? Republicans wield outsized power by prevailing in small states. Given the dense network of formidable opponents of change, the prospects of rewriting the Constitution are dim. Change is possible, but it must be strategically attuned to institutional patterns and organized constraints. Reforms that tilt toward elite checking and equal voice will be most effective if they are designed to begin small to get started without provoking intense resistance. This will require both resources, money, and organizational capacity for political engagement, and a new conception of democracy as engaging broad, rather than narrow, constituencies. Another key strategic objective is activating well-organized supporters across America's federated structures, down to the community level. The history of democratic reform counsels modesty and patience instead of grandiosity and appreciation for short-term halfway steps that can divide opponents enough to get policy balls rolling in new directions. This pragmatic approach differs from the naive mugwump tradition of reformers who latch onto apolitical idealized models in which power inequalities disappear and the people prevail. The opportunities of elite divisions and citizen renewal. The potential for strategically tailored reform exists. The history of democracy is one of conflict over political equality and democratic institutions, as established arrangements collide with new forces, interests, and identities. The fight for voters by rival political factions has, at certain junctures, activated otherwise submerged conflicts, boosted citizen awareness of their stakes, lifted participation, and reconfigured the terms of elite competition. Following Barack Obama's 2012 re-election, the Republican Party conducted an autopsy to explain its loss of the popular vote in 5 of the last 6 presidential elections, a streak that Trump extended to 7 of the last 8 contests. The Sober Party report traced its minority status to catering to its core constituencies and its failure to be inclusive and welcoming to women and Hispanics in order to broaden the base of the party and invite as many voters as possible. The demographics change and reshuffled electoral constituencies have continued. 55% of the white vote propelled Ronald Reagan to a landslide in 1980, but sent Mitt Romney to a decisive loss to Barack Obama. This shifting outcome is tied to the sharply declining proportion of the electorate that is white. It fell from nearly 90% in 1980 to 74% in 2008 and 67% in the 2020 presidential election. The rapid demographic change was starkly evident in the 2021 Georgia U.S. Senate special election. In the heart of the Old South, Reverend Raphael Warnock won with 29% of the white electorate and 85% of the non-white vote. The rising prominence of voters of color both presses against forms of political inequality, including primaries, and agitates white voters unnerved by change and provoked by politicians. The rush by Republican-controlled legislatures after the 2020 election to enact new voter restrictions repeats a recurring reactionary response, as does the resistance and conflict. Egalitarian change triggers the ideologies and practices associated with America's white supremacist order. Demography alone is unlikely to produce transformation. Even with Trump's deeply set racial nationalism, he adjusts his 2020 presidential campaign to compete more effectively in 2020 than 2016 for Latino voters and African Americans. He increased his support among Latinos by 8 points and blacks by 7 points compared to 2016. In addition, congressional Republican candidates flipped several Democratic seats with the support of their constituencies. Nonetheless, Democrats continue to enjoy large majority support from the fastest-growing segments of the electorate, Latinos, accounting for 52% of population growth from 2010 to 2019, and Asians, who nearly doubled in size in the 2010 to 2019 period. In addition, the national and state Republican strategy of erecting barriers that disproportionately hinder voters of color instigates voters of color defying the GOP autopsy's recommendation. This is a dubious strategy in the face of significant voting rights laws, even after recent Supreme Court decisions, and a phalanx of organizations and donors that will turn out voters of color and go to court to overturn these laws. Political turbulence and change create opportunity. While most Americans are anchored by partisan loyalty, there is a broader unease. After a year that featured extraordinarily visceral racial tensions and President Trump's ungrounded charges of voter fraud, 65% of Americans report that the political system needs dramatic change, compared to 47% in the United Kingdom and 39% in Germany. The challenge for reformers seeking to restrain elites and foster political equality and popular consent is to navigate the strong, inertial elements in American politics, while exploiting the cracks in political coalitions and changing electoral constituencies. Reforms to restrain elites. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, James Madison counseled in 1788, the great difficulty lies in this: you must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. American commentators since the 18th century have been preoccupied by fear of popular revolt. And yet, it was Donald Trump, not agrarian populists, the protesters at the violent 1968 Chicago Convention, or mourners of George Floyd, who bear responsibility for the storming of the U.S. Capitol and incendiary demagoguery to overthrow the authority and legitimacy of democratic institutions. Insufficient attention has been given to the second part of Madison's counsel, controlling governing elites. Madison's warning from 2 centuries ago rings loud today. Men of factious tempers or of sinister designs may gain power and then betray the interests of the people. The Constitution's checks and balances have deadlocked Congress, but presidents now wield enormous unilateral powers to act, manipulate citizens, and cower their partisans in Congress. The first step toward rejuvenating political representation is to mitigate the threat of governing elites. Defending the formal rules and procedures of political representation. The attacks on New York and the Pentagon on September 11, 2001, precipitated unilateral actions by President George W. Bush to conduct spying, torture, permanent detentions, including of U.S. citizens, and more. By 2008, many of President Bush's policies were blunted. The source? A defense of the Constitution and law by lawyers, and a panoply of civic organizations from advocates of civil liberties to humanitarian activists and religious groups. The rule of law, seemingly so vulnerable in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, proved far more resilient, David Cole reports, because of the loosely coordinated political actions of concerned individuals and groups that took up the task of defending liberty and the law. President Bush, who initially rejected the constraints of law, was forced to retreat after citizens rose up, intent on defending America's formal rules and procedures. A similar civic mobilization to defend the procedures and laws of fair elections is emerging and necessary. Under the frightful shadow of a pandemic that threatened the 2020 elections, tens of thousands of citizens volunteered as poll workers. When President Trump challenged Joe Biden's victories, the elaborate legal doctrine on elections was joined by a broad network of democracy advocates, as well as campaign supporters. Previously faceless election officials became the visible bulwark of the rigorous conducting of the elections, and then the recounting of votes and verification of signatures. Prominent election administrators, such as Georgia's Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, set aside their partisan affiliations and preference for Trump to follow the law and established administrative procedure. My team at the University of Minnesota started in 2009 to work with frontline election officials to support and advance the professionalization of election administration. The Certificate in Election Administration now offers the country's first full online curriculum for current election officials around the country who are seeking new skills, as well as students interested in entering the profession. The courses are taught by experienced, nonpartisan, and admired leaders in election administration, and train students in election law, as well as best practices in administrative procedures, data management, and election security. As waves of students move through the program, it is adding to the dissemination of common concepts of standards of practice and offering an alternative to the ad hoc, word-of-mouth practices in some states. The national professionalization of elections meshes the federated structure of political representation with the growing administrative capacity of local, state, and national jurisdictions. Election officials are the frontline defenders of democratic institutions, and 2020 demonstrated that civic groups and the judiciary count on them to be the trusted workers of democracy. Defending democracy requires investment in the infrastructure of elections and protecting its formal rules and procedures. Restoring political parties as representative institutions. Andrew Jackson and his strategist Martin Van Buren redefined political parties as integral to political representation and the filtering of public views in the selection of presidential candidates with appropriate character. Crowley and other progressive-era critics of La Follette similarly defended the party as a core component of the representative process. It is time to disrupt the party's modern use as a pass-through for the factious preferences of activists, groups, and donors. Instead, we need to restore the representative function of political parties. This entails returning power in some form to party officials and allies who are focused on winning the support of majorities and mobilizing a broader spectrum of Americans, including marginalized groups. Turning to political parties to revive democracy faces two challenges. First, surprisingly little new thinking has been devoted to designing new reforms of political party structures to advance political equality. The paucity of serious practical thinking about political parties as an integral institution of political representation extends even to those who emphasize the importance of democratic rules and procedures. Second, antipathy to political parties is one of the constants in American political history. The imperfections of political parties are real, and yet pale in comparison to the dire threats to democracy. The political party is an instrument for creating a system of political control that channels competition among candidates toward responding to majorities and filters out candidates that would undermine the Constitution. Today's imperative is to equip the next set of party leaders to do what Republicans were unable in 2016. Block the nomination of Donald Trump. several party reforms can contribute to restoring political representation. Fewer and more important elections. We have an election problem. Americans are called upon to enter the ballot box to elect 519,682 officials for national, state, and local offices, from president to township posts and school districts. Primaries are a multiplier, inflating the number of elections. Many voters, for instance, cast ballots twice every 2 years for the U.S. House of Representatives, first in the primary and then in the general election. America's election mania is not normal compared to Western Europe. Americans may be asked to vote in 20 to 40 separate national, state, and local contests within a 4-year period. By contrast, German voters cast ballots in as few as 6 to 8 races during a 4 or 5 year stretch. Some mayoral elections occur every 6 to 8 years. Local elections in the United Kingdom boost the number of elections, but the tally is still considerably less than in the United States, 12 races at most in a 4-year period, with most voters participating in fewer than 10 races. The sheer number of elected offices is exacerbated by the frequency with which voters are called to cast ballots. Turning out several times a year is common. Some parts of the country look to voters to cast ballots on 4 or 5 occasions a year. Adding to the burden is the complexity of tracking candidates, the separate locations and timing of elections, and the distinctive laws that govern contests across the country. America's glut of elections is another ill-conceived scheme hatched during the Progressive Era to achieve accountability. Insider advantages, outright corruption, and unresponsive government would be eliminated, reformers imagined, by putting more and more officials on the ballot and expecting citizens to turn out repeatedly and make discerning choices. But equating the proliferation of elections with genuine democracy is wrong. In practice, the Progressive Era reforms further truncated democracy into elections, sapping the capacity for other forms of citizen engagement and organizing. Even on its own terms, more elections overloaded citizens. For each election, they need to divert time from work and family to physically cast a ballot, gather information to distinguish the many candidates on many ballots, and cast a meaningful vote. Overloaded citizens with little information skip elections. Apart from the marquee presidential contests, majorities of people skip or ignore today's flood of elections, especially in races for local and certain state offices. Even in the important elections to Congress, a half or less of the voting age population turns out for midterm contests. With many citizens opting out, the voters who turn up often come with an agenda or interest to promote, contradicting Progressive-era hopes of broad citizen participation. Constant voting is not intrinsically democratic, as demonstrated in Europe and elsewhere. Governments in parliamentary democracies commonly take 4 or 5 years to enact their agendas, simplifying the work of citizens to judge the performance of elected officials. Near the end of his life, Walter Mondale lucidly reflected on his conversations with Hubert Humphrey about the McGovern-Fraser reforms, which multiplied America's election mania. Mondale concluded that the decision in the 1970s to adopt primaries pushed us off track from the substantive debates between the parties. It's healthier, he reasoned, for our democracy to fight it out between the parties over the policy issues that are most important to the American people. Mondale returned to the advice of Progressive-era critics of primaries and Martin Van Buren. Treat political parties as a method of representation and recoup their place in nominations and elections. Crowley forcefully positioned political parties as the practical means by which government by the people worked through their representatives, and gave priority to the national interest as opposed to the self-interests of party factions and stakeholders. The Mondale proposal for fewer really good elections that matter more would require a serious public conversation about the feasibility and democratic payoff of America's flood of elections. Taking seriously the costs to citizens might lead to a host of sensible decisions. Retire defunct municipal and local elections that draw few candidates and voters. Hold national, state, and local elections on the same dates. And consolidate primaries in states within a particular region. The aim should be concentrating the public mind and elevating public awareness and knowledge. These steps would move toward the conditions for democracy recommended by progressive thinker John Dewey. Designing institutions, too, improve the methods and conditions of debate, discussion, and persuasion. Strengthening the institutional attention to the median voter. Officials in properly reconstituted political parties are institutionally wired to pursue electoral success by selecting candidates with the best opportunities to win general elections. The problem is that primaries distort these incentives by overweighting for the activists, groups, and donors who disproportionately influence nominations. A targeted step to elevate consideration of the median voter is to continue and expand superdelegates, party convention delegates selected because they are elected officials and senior party leaders. They introduce a kind of peer review to the nomination process that factors in governing experience, weeds out renegades, and incorporates the potential to win the small but decisive median voters needed to prevail in general elections. Initially, the Democrats, and not the Republicans, created superdelegates after the landslide losses of George McGovern in 1972 and Jimmy Carter in 1980. They comprise about 15% of National Convention delegates. In the Republican Party, unpledged delegates make up about half that proportion of National Convention delegates. Increasing the number of untethered delegates creates the potential to block unacceptable candidates by tipping the nomination. Trump won more than the required simple majority of the delegates in 2016 because candidates dropped out. This is neither a surprise nor a prediction of a future with different rules. They departed once they saw no prospect of prevailing. But if the Republican Party had a robust body of unpledged delegates, along with a stronger push by party leaders to weed out hopeless candidates to provide a clear alternative, moderate candidates would have a reason to remain in the race. Making the case for superdelegates collides with the mistaken equity of democracy, with primaries, and the weakening of parties. Indeed, the Democratic Party diminished superdelegates in the 2020 convention by limiting their participation during the first ballot. My counsel? Resist. The defense of the heavily biased system of primaries opened the door to Trump and Wallace and supports vast political inequality. Superdelegates are a buffer against dangerous candidates. The current level of unpledged and superdelegates is too low and too constrained to matter. Arcing toward political equality. The future of democracy is tied to mobilizing a broader spectrum of citizens and incorporating the intermittent voters whom politicos skip as a bad investment. Inclusively recruiting citizens is the path to improve political equality and enlarging the challenges to governing elites who discount large segments of citizens. Progress will require going beyond hortatory appeals to redesigning institutions. Here are 2 reforms. Let them fight it out. The first invites broader participation in party nominations in order to 1. Offset the control of activists and organized groups, and 2. Promote the selection of moderate candidates. Reformers have pressed states to open participation in primaries to any registered voters instead of closed contests, restricted to registered partisans. The hope is that open primaries will attract sufficient political independence and less extreme partisans who back moderate candidates to offset ideological party factions. While the concept of broadening participation to create countervailing pressures seems sensible, the initial results are mixed. Another reform to wire moderation into elections is the creation of a nonpartisan primary in which the top 2 finishers, even if in the same party, go on to face each other in the general election. California's nonpartisan primary, or top two system, has received particular attention. The results are not yet consistently delivering the desired impacts. The success of these reforms in counteracting narrow factions and controlling party nominations remains uncertain, but worthy of continued experimentation. Nonetheless, neither reform possesses significant risk of further accelerating polarization. Given the threats of the current primary system, the risks of leaving the current system in place appear higher than reforms to create open or nonpartisan primaries. Crashing the room where it happens. The Broadway musical Hamilton artfully captures political dealing in The Room Where It Happens. Populated with the framers of America's Constitution, the showstopper dissects the bare-knuckled but effective negotiation of authoritative governing elites when no one else was in the room. No one really knows how the game is played, the art of the trade, how the sausage gets made. We just assume that it happens. Hamilton supplies a toe-bouncing musical snapshot of America's habitual deference to the necessity of governing elites, striking secret compacts. Great music, but a dangerous model for making decisions. Hamilton traded favors to create a national bank. He touted it as essential to spurring economic growth, but its secretive maneuvering later contributed to recurrent populist backlashes and Andrew Jackson's election on the pledge to end it. The activism of state politics in the 1780s revives another model for robust political representation. It pairs the broad organizing of citizens, including the marginalized, with an insider strategy to penetrate the room where it happens, to influence the art of the trade. This form of governing challenges the contemporary insularity of American politics, while still retaining the rules and procedures associated with political representation, the bedrock principles of equal political participation, along with the practical work of negotiation and policy formulation. The model of the 1780s that marries grassroots organizing and the effective influencing of government policymaking enjoys a long, varied, and continuing tradition. Associations of millions of volunteers in organizations like Kiwanis, the Temperance Society, and many others linked everyday people into substantive policy debates within local, state, and federal governments. Contemporary grassroots organizing is committed to sustaining citizen activism and cultivating the necessary skills to penetrate the room where it happens, with a particular focus on marginalized communities that previously lacked power. Organizers of public deliberations are focused on connecting the community with its government. The point of town hall meetings and organized community deliberations is not to just talk, but also to motivate powerful actors to be encouraged, persuaded, or obliged to heed citizens. The pairing of robust citizen engagement with elite negotiation is receiving growing interest in the United States and globally. Public budgeting is wiring citizen assemblies into debates over government spending priorities and receiving attention. Within the United States, government agencies have been required by statute and courts to solicit input from groups and individuals directly impacted by new policies. Reforms of the Chicago Police Department and Chicago Public Schools incorporated empowered participation and deliberation into their governance structures. Bridgeport, Connecticut, and San Jose, California are other examples of efforts to join citizens into the process of government decision-making. The model of the 1780s departs from the contemporary focus on short-term transactional mobilization for a candidate by engaging in sustained organizing. It also differs from the assumption that protest and social disruption are the only models of change. The search for steps to reinvigorate political representation is vital, but requires caution born of experience. New innovations, from public budgeting to citizen engagement in policing, confront the familiar barriers of elite gaming and resistance. Nor are these admirable experiments spared the risk that political activists, on both the left and right, will assume outsized influence. Designing institutions for democratic governance is hard work. Watching for unintended effects is as important as imagining the payoff of change. The fight for American democracy. The dire challenges facing American democracy require a new politics. Life's sharply uneven circumstances have torn the social fabric. The civic culture, rooted in the U.S. Constitution and law that impressed observers since the 19th century, has frayed. Political polarization has corrupted perceptions of reality and infused hatred into differences over policy and candidates. Building democracy is hard work. Time to roll up our sleeves and join our neighbors in the noble work of our public lives. This has been a Kalorama production, read by Michael Butler Murray, a member of SAG-AFTRA. Copyright 2022 by Oxford University Press. Published by arrangement with Oxford University Press. Recording copyright 2022 by Kalorama, an imprint of Recorded Books, Highbridge.